Clara Whitfield slammed the folded paper down on the boarding house table so hard the lamp jumped. "Read it to me again," she said, her voice shaking. "The part where it says I'm to be his wife." The old woman across from her wouldn't meet her eyes. "Miss Whitfield, I thought you knew. The whole valley knew. You were never hired to teach his children." Clara's hand went to her mouth. 2,000 miles from Boston with no money to go back, she had just learned the town had sold her future to a man she'd never met. If a story about second chances on the American frontier is something your heart needs today, please take a moment to subscribe and follow this story all the way to the end. And tell me in the comments, what town are you watching from tonight? I love seeing how far these stories travel across this country. Now let's begin. The stagecoach let Clara Whitfield down in the dust of Miller's Crossing, Montana territory at 2:30 in the afternoon and left her there. She stood beside her trunk with her gloved hands folded and her chin lifted the way her mother had taught her, and she waited. She had come 2,000 miles on the strength of a single letter, and that letter had said plain as anything that someone would meet her. No one came. The town went on around her as if she were a fence post. A blacksmith hammered. A woman in a faded bonnet crossed the street with a basket and did not look up. Two men leaned against the wall of the mercantile and spoke low, and Clara had the distinct and uncomfortable feeling they were speaking about her. An hour passed. The sun leaned west. She had eaten nothing since dawn. Her feet ached inside her good boots, and her collar had wilted against her neck, and still she stood, because a lady did not sit on her trunk in the middle of a strange street like a package waiting to be claimed. "You the teacher?" She turned. A boy sat on a spotted horse a few feet off, maybe 12 years old, with a shock of dark hair under a hat too big for him, and a face already set hard as a man's. He looked at her the way you'd look at a stray dog that had wandered into your yard deciding whether to feed it or run it off. "I am," Clara said. "Clara Whitfield. And you are Henry." He didn't offer more. His eyes went to her trunk, then back to her face. "My pa was supposed to come." "Yes, he was." "He didn't. I noticed." The boy said nothing to that. He looked at her a long moment, and something moved behind his eyes that she couldn't read. Resentment, she thought, or maybe something underneath the resentment that he'd learned to cover with it. "Did he forget?" Clara asked. Henry's jaw worked. "My pa don't forget things." "Then why?" "Get your trunk," the boy said and turned his horse. She didn't move. "Young man, I have traveled a very long way. I have been standing in this street for the better part of 2 hours. I would be grateful for one civil word before I climb into a wagon with a child I've never met and ride off to a house I've never seen." "Is that so much to ask?" Henry pulled the horse around again. He looked at her, and for just a second, a flicker, he looked like exactly what he was, which was a boy who had learned to be hard because being soft had cost him too much. "There's a wagon behind the livery," he said quieter. "I'll help you load." "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet, ma'am." He said it under his breath, but she heard it, and it sat in her chest like a cold stone the whole ride out of town. The wagon rattled north along a rutted road with the mountains standing blue and enormous on the far edge of everything. Clara had never seen country so big. In Boston, the sky was a thing you glimpsed between buildings. Out here it was the whole world pressing down, and it made her feel very small and very far from anyone who had ever loved her. She tried once to make conversation. "Your father owns the ranch, I understand. And there's a school. He built it," Henry said. "By the creek, so Lucy and me wouldn't grow up dumb." "Lucy is your sister. She's 8. A pause. "She's why my pa put out for a teacher. Not you special, just a teacher." There was something pointed in the way he said it, some meaning under the words that she was too tired to chase. She let it go. The Walker Ranch came up on them slow. A low log house with a good stone chimney, a barn, a corral, and beyond it, the pale gold of grass rolling out to the base of the hills. Cattle stood scattered across the far pasture like brown stones. Smoke rose thin and straight from the chimney. Someone was home. A little girl came flying off the porch before the wagon had stopped. "Are you her? Are you the teacher?" She had her brother's dark hair and none of his hardness, and she looked up at Clara with her whole heart in her face. "I've been watching the road all day. Henry said you might not come at all." "I came," Clara said, and something in her chest eased for the first time since Boston. "You must be Lucy." "I can already read some. I can read cat and dog and God, but I can't read because it doesn't sound like it looks." "No," Clara said, and almost laughed. "It surely doesn't." "Lucy." The voice came from the porch. "Let her breathe." He stood in the doorway with his hat in his hand, and Clara understood at once why the boy had said, "Don't thank me yet." Thomas Walker was a big man, broad through the shoulders, gone a little gray at the temples, though he couldn't have been much past 40. His face was weathered brown and closed like a door. He looked at her the way a man looks at a debt he isn't sure he can pay. "Miss Whitfield," he said. "Mr. Walker." She climbed down without waiting for a hand because none was offered. "You were to meet me at the coach." "I was." "You didn't?" His jaw tightened the same way the boy's had. "No, ma'am, I didn't, and that was all." No apology. No reason. He set his hat back on his head and came down the steps and lifted her trunk out of the wagon bed like it weighed nothing and carried it inside, and Clara stood in the yard with the 2 children watching her, and thought, "I have made a terrible mistake." The inside of the house was clean and spare. A good table, 4 chairs, a stone hearth, a shelf of tinware, and on the mantel a single daguerreotype, in a tin frame, a woman young with a sweet, grave face. Clara knew without asking who she was. The whole house was arranged around that photograph the way a room arranges itself around a coffin. Thomas set her trunk down against the wall. "Lucy'll show you where you sleep," he said. "There's supper at 6. School starts Monday." He looked at her, and for just a moment something crossed his face that she couldn't name, something like guilt or dread. Then it was gone. "You'll want to rest. Mr. Walker." He stopped. "I'd like to understand my situation," Clara said. "The letter I received was from a Mr. Abernathy of the town council. It spoke of a teaching position, a salary and lodging. It said nothing about a private household. I confess I expected to board in town near the school. I did not expect to live under a stranger's roof." Thomas was quiet a moment. "Things are done different out here." "Evidently." "You'll be paid what you were promised." "That isn't my question. My question is why the arrangement is not what I was told." He looked at the floor. He looked at his children. And then he did the thing she would come to know as the truest measure of the man. He told her a piece of the truth and buried the rest. "The school's on my land," he said. "Nearest boarding house is 8 miles. It made sense for you to be here." He put his hat back on. "That's all." It wasn't all. She knew it wasn't all. But she was exhausted and hungry and 2,000 miles from anyone, and so she let it lie. And that was her first mistake in the Montana Territory, though it would be far from her last. She unpacked that evening in a small, clean room that had plainly been prepared for her fresh straw in the tick, a candle, a basin, a square of good soap. Someone had gone to trouble. That surprised her. The man downstairs did not seem like someone who went to trouble for anyone. At 6 supper. It was a silent meal. Thomas ate with his eyes on his plate. Henry ate the same way, in open imitation of his father, and Clara understood that the boy was learning to be a man from the only man he had, and that the man he had did not know how to be anything but silent. Only Lucy talked, and she talked enough for all of them. "Miss Whitfield, do they have snow in Boston? Do they have the ocean?" "Henry says the ocean's bigger than all the grass, but I don't believe him. Nothing's bigger than all the grass. Have you seen the ocean? Is it true you can't drink it?" "It's true," Clara said. "It's salt." "Salt?" Lucy looked delighted and appalled. "The whole ocean is salt. Who salted it?" "Nobody. It's just made that way." "Pa, did you know the ocean's made of salt?" "I knew it." Thomas said, not looking up. "Did you ever see it?" A pause. Something moved in the man's shoulders. "Once, long time ago." "With Mama." The fork stopped halfway to his mouth. The whole room went still. Even Lucy seemed to feel the ground open under the question a half-second too late. Thomas set the fork down. "Eat your supper, Lucy," he said, and his voice wasn't harsh, but it was final, and the little girl's face fell, and she ate her supper. Clara looked at the man across the table at the way his big hand had gone flat and careful against the wood at the muscle working in his jaw, and something in her that had been braced for a difficult employer softened a fraction into something more complicated. She had come out here nursing her own wound, the broken engagement the family scattered the future, that had simply dissolved. She had thought herself the only wounded person on this road. She saw now that she'd walked into a house full of wounds, and that this man had built his whole life into a wall around a grief he could not speak aloud, and that his children were growing up in the shadow of that wall. None of my concern, she told herself. I am the teacher. I will teach. She almost believed it. 2 days later, she learned how wrong she was. It was Saturday. Thomas had ridden out before dawn to move cattle, and Henry had gone with him, and Lucy had fallen asleep over her slate, and Clara had walked the 2 miles into Miller's Crossing to buy thread and a few things at the mercantile, glad of the walk and the chance to be for one afternoon a woman in a town instead of a stranger on a ranch. She had just set her small purchases on the counter when a knot of women near the dry goods went quiet, and then not quiet, in the particular way women go quiet, and then not quiet when a subject enters the room. "That's her," one of them said, not quite low enough. "The one for Walker." Clara kept her eyes on the counter. "Poor thing," said another. "Does she even know? How could she not know you don't come 2,000 miles to a widower's ranch and think you're only there to teach? Some of them do. Abernathy said the last one figured it out and got right back on the coach. Cost the council good money, that did. That's why they weren't so plain with this one." Clara's hands had gone still on the counter. Her whole body had gone still. They didn't tell her, the first woman said, and there was pity in it, real pity, which was somehow worse than cruelty would have been. Walker wouldn't. He couldn't bring himself to. So the council wrote the letter to make it sound like a teaching post, and they figured once she was out here with no money to go back and no other prospects, well, where's she going to go? It's a wicked thing to do to a girl. It's a practical thing. That man needs a wife. Those children need a mother. And there's not a woman in this valley willing to take on Walker's silence and Walker's grief and Walker's boy who bites. So they sent east for one who wouldn't know better till it was too late. Clara turned around. The women stopped. There is a particular silence that falls when people realize the person they've been discussing has heard every word, and it fell now thick and hot and shameful over the mercantile. "Ma'am," one of them managed. "I heard you," Clara said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I heard all of it. I would be grateful if one of you, any of you, would tell me plainly to my face what I have just heard secondhand. Was I brought here to teach, or was I brought here to marry?" Nobody spoke. "Please," Clara said, and hated the crack that got into the word. "I have come a very long way on a promise. I would like to know what the promise actually was." An older woman stepped forward. She had a kind, tired face, and the roughened hands of someone who had buried more than she'd kept. "Sit down, child," she said gently. "I'll tell you what I know. And I'll tell you plain, because you've a right to it, whatever the men of this town think a right is." Her name was Mrs. Doone, and she owned the boarding house. And she made Clara a cup of coffee in the back room and told her the truth, the way you'd set a bone quickly, because dragging it out only made it worse. 4 years back, Thomas Walker's wife had died bringing Lucy into the world. Thomas had not spoken more than 10 words together to another grown soul since, except about cattle and weather. He'd raised the children alone and half broke himself doing it. The town, which is to say the council, which is to say the men who ran things, who worried about a good rancher going to ruin, and a good man going hollow, and 2 children going wild, had decided in the way that towns decide things over cards and coffee, without ever asking the people. It's decided about that. What Thomas Walker needed was a wife. They'd tried the widows in the valley. None would have him. Not the silence, not the grief, not the sharp-toothed boy. So Mr. Abernathy had put an advertisement east. and when the first respondent had arrived, understood the situation, and left on the next coach, they had learned to be less honest. The second letter, Clara's letter, had spoken only of teaching, of salary, of lodging. It had let a lonely, jilted young woman from Boston fill in the rest with her own hopes, and those hopes had carried her 2,000 miles into a trap dressed up as an opportunity. "Does he know?" Clara asked when Mrs. Doone had finished. Her coffee had gone cold. "Mr. Walker, does he know what they wrote to me, what they promised on his behalf?" Mrs. Doone was quiet a moment. "That I can't rightly say. Thomas Walker's not a scheming man, whatever else he is. My guess is he told Abernathy he'd take a teacher for the children, and Abernathy did the rest, and Thomas didn't ask too many questions, because asking would have meant looking too close at his own loneliness, and that's a thing that man will not do." She reached across and put her rough, warm hand over Clara's. "But I'll tell you this, child. Whatever they schemed in the council, that man is not holding you to any of it. He's not the sort. If you want to teach, and nothing more, he'll let you teach. If you want to leave—" She hesitated. "Leaving's harder. You've no money, and the coach costs, and there's no work for a lady in this valley but the one they brought you for. That's the cruelty of it. They didn't have to force you. They just had to leave you nowhere else to go." Clara walked the 2 miles back to the ranch with the afternoon dying gold across the grass, and every step feeling like it belonged to someone else. She thought about Boston, about Edward, who was to have married her and had married someone with more money instead. About her mother, gone 2 years now, and her father remarried and moved to Ohio, and the aunt whose spare room she'd overstayed until the room's welcome wore through. She thought about the advertisement, and how it had felt reading it like a door opening in a wall she'd thought had no doors. A teacher wanted, passage paid. She had wept over it, she remembered, wept with relief. She had thought someone somewhere still has use for me, and they had. Just not the use she'd been told. By the time she reached the yard, the anger had burned down to something colder and clearer. She would speak to him. Tonight. She would not carry this in silence the way everyone in this God-forsaken valley carried everything in silence. If she was to be a party to a bargain, she would at least know she was in it. Thomas was at the corral working oil into a saddle by the last of the light. He looked up when she came, and something in her face must have told him, because he set the saddle down slow and stood the way a man stands when he knows a reckoning has arrived. "You went to town," he said. "I did. And somebody talked. Somebody did." He nodded once, like a man taking a blow he'd been waiting on for days. He didn't pretend not to know. She'd give him that always in the years after. He never once pretended not to know. "Mr. Walker." She kept her voice level with an effort that cost her everything. "I was told I came here to teach your children. I have learned this afternoon in the middle of a mercantile from women who pitied me that the town intended something else entirely. That they meant for me to be your wife. That the letter was written to conceal it. I would like to hear from you in your own words whether that is true." For a long moment he said nothing. The wind moved through the grass. A cow lowed somewhere out in the dark. "Sit down," he finally said, and gestured at the rail. "I'll stand." "All right." He took his hat off, turned it slow in his hands, and when he spoke, his voice was rougher than she'd heard it. "Abernathy came to me last spring. Said the children needed schooling. I knew that. I'd known it. Built the schoolhouse myself, board by board, thinking maybe some family'd move out with a wife who could teach or some such." He shook his head. "He said he'd write east for a teacher. I said do it. I paid the passage. That much I knew about. And the rest," his jaw worked. "The rest I didn't write. I want that plain between us, ma'am. I never wrote you a word. I never told any man you were to be my wife. If Abernathy and them put that in a letter, they did it without my say." "But you knew," Clara said. "You knew what they wanted, what they were arranging. You knew, and you let them send for a woman 2,000 miles under a promise you knew was only half true." Thomas Walker looked at her, and for the first time since she'd arrived, the door in his face came open a crack, and she saw what was behind it, and it was not cruelty. It was shame. "Yes," he said. "I knew. God help me, I knew what they were about and I didn't stop them, and I've hated myself for it every day since your coach was due." He turned the hat in his hands. "You want to know why I didn't come meet you? Why I sent the boy? Because I couldn't stand in that street and shake your hand knowing what you didn't know. Couldn't do it. Coward's reason. But that's the truth of it, and you've had enough lies from this valley, so you'll have the truth from me." Clara found she had nothing ready to say. She had come prepared to be met with denial, or with the coarse assumption that of course she'd marry him. Where else would she go? She had not come prepared for a man to stand in front of her in the dark and name his own cowardice out loud. "Mr. Walker," she said at last, "what do you want from me?" "Nothing." He said it fast, hard. "That's what I want you to understand. I want nothing from you that you don't freely give. You want to teach, my children, teach them. You want to draw your wage and keep your own counsel, and never say a word to me, but good morning and good night. That's your right, and I'll honor it. And if you want to go, I have no money to go. I'll give you the money." He said it plainly, as if it were nothing, as if it were not half his ready cash. "I'll drive you to the coach myself. You'll not be held here by an empty purse. I won't have that on my head along with the rest." She stared at him. "You'd pay my passage back to Boston, to keep me from being trapped in a bargain you never made." "I'd pay it tonight if you asked." And there it was, the thing that undid her, though she didn't know it yet, standing in that dark yard, with her heart still hammering from the mercantile. Not a grand speech, not a declaration. Just a broke, grieving, guilt-ridden man, offering to spend money he could barely spare to give a stranger a way out. He had no obligation to provide, because he could not stand to be one more person who'd done her wrong. "I'm not going back to Boston," Clara heard herself say. Thomas went still. "There's nothing in Boston for me," she said, and it came out steadier than she felt. "That's the truth you'll have from me, Mr. Walker, since we're trading truths in the dark like a couple of gamblers. I didn't come west for an adventure. I came because I had nowhere left to be. My mother is dead. My father has a new wife and a new life in Ohio with no room in it for me. The man I was to marry married another. I overstayed my welcome in my aunt's house until there was no welcome left. When I read that advertisement, I wept because it was the first door I'd found in a very long time." She lifted her chin. "So I am not going to let you drive me to the coach and send me back to a city that is finished with me simply because a pack of councilmen lied about the terms. I'll teach your children. I'm good at it. It's the one thing in this world I know I'm good at. And when the term is out, we'll speak again about what comes after. But I am not getting on any coach tonight." Thomas Walker looked at her a long, long moment. "All right," he said quietly. "All right. You'll be paid your wage, every cent, and you'll have my word in front of God and my children that no man in this valley, including me, has any claim on you but the one you choose to give." He put his hat back on. "That's not nothin', ma'am. In this country, a man's word's about all he's got. I'm giving you mine." "Then I'll take it," Clara said, "and I'll hold you to it. I'd expect nothing less." Something passed between them, then not warmth, not yet. It was far too soon, and they were both far too wounded for warmth. But an understanding. A truce struck between two people who had each been handed a raw deal by life and had each against every instinct decided to be honest about it with the other. It was more than most marriages are built on. It was certainly more than the town had planned. "Miss Whitfield." He stopped at the corral gate. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry for all of it. For the letter and the street and the coward's welcome." He didn't look at her when he said it. He looked out at the dark grass. "You deserved better than this valley gave you. I mean to see you get it one way or another." And then he went in to his children, and Clara stood alone in the yard under a sky so wide and so scattered with stars that it made her dizzy, and she understood that whatever she had come west to find, she had not found it, and that whatever she had found was going to be far stranger and far harder and far more her own than anything the council had schemed over their cards. She did not sleep much that night. She lay in the small, clean room someone had troubled to prepare for her and listened to the strange sounds of a strange country. The wind, the far-off cattle, a coyote once thin and lonesome, and she turned the day over and over. The women in the mercantile, Mrs. Doone's rough, warm hand, Thomas Walker's shame, his word, no claim but the one you choose to give. She thought about Henry's face in the street. "Don't thank me yet, ma'am," and understood now what the boy had meant. He'd known. Of course he'd known. A boy of 12 on a ranch that small knew everything the grown folks pretended he didn't. He'd known his father had sent east for a woman, and he'd known what for, and he'd watched his dead mother's kitchen wait for a stranger to walk into it, and he'd hated that stranger before she ever climbed down off the coach. Not because of anything she'd done, because of everything she represented. That Clara thought staring at the dark ceiling is a wound I understand. That is a wound I can work with. Because Clara Whitfield knew something about being the person left behind, while the world rearranged itself around a loss. She knew what it was to have your place quietly given to someone else. If anyone in that house was going to understand the sharp-toothed boy who bit it, was going to be her. She got up before dawn the way she always did. She'd meant to slip out quiet and start acquainting herself with the schoolhouse before the children woke. But when she came into the main room, Thomas was already there, and so was a stack of firewood by the hearth that had not been there the night before. Split fresh and small kitchen size, the kind you'd cut for a woman's stove and not a man's. "You're up early," he said, not quite looking at her, pulling on his coat to go out to the stock. "So are you." "Always am." She looked at the firewood. "Did you cut that?" A pause. "Henry did." He said it too fast. Clara looked at the neat, small split wood, and looked at the man, and did not believe him for 1 second, and had the grace not to say so. "Then thank Henry for me," she said. "I'll do that." He went out. She stood alone in the quiet kitchen, with the dead woman's photograph watching from the mantel, and the fresh-cut wood by the cold stove, and she thought about a man who could not say, "I'm glad you're staying," and so set it in firewood, instead in the dark, before anyone could see him do it. She built up the fire. She put on the coffee, and when Lucy came stumbling out in her nightdress, dark hair, every direction, asking was there really a whole ocean made of salt, and could Clara please tell her again about Boston? Clara sat her down at the table and poured her a little coffee, cut heavy with milk, and told her about Boston until the sun came up over the grass. Henry came out last, wary, watching her the way he'd watched her in the street. She poured him coffee too black the way she'd seen his father take it, and set it in front of him without a word, as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world, as if he were a grown man of the house, and not a boy of 12 trying to be one. He looked at the cup. He looked at her. "I don't need coddling," he said. "It's coffee, Henry, not coddling. You'll notice I didn't cut it with milk like your sister's. That's a man's cup, or it's nothing. Drink it or don't." Something flickered in his face, surprise, and under it grudging the very first faint crack in a wall he'd built high. He picked up the cup. He drank it black and didn't wince, though it plainly cost him. "It's good," he admitted, like the words hurt coming out. "I know it is," Clara said. "I made it." And the boy almost smiled. It was nothing. It was 1 cup of coffee on one gray morning in a house full of grief in a valley that had lied to her. But Clara Whitfield had spent her whole life learning to read the almost smiles of children who'd been taught it wasn't safe to smile all the way, and she recognized this one for what it was. A beginning. A hairline crack in a locked door. She had come west to teach reading and sums. She saw now she'd been given a harder subject entirely. A silent man, a biting boy, a motherless girl, and a house that had been holding its breath for 4 years. The town thought they'd solved their problem by tricking a Boston teacher into a trap. They had no idea what they'd actually sent for. They'd sent for a woman who knew exactly what it felt like to be handed someone else's leftover life and told to make do. And that woman was right now standing in a stranger's kitchen with her sleeves rolled up, pouring coffee for a boy who'd sworn to hate her, deciding not for the town, not for the council, not even yet for the man who'd offered to buy her freedom, but for herself, that she was staying, that she was going to stay and teach and see, that she was going to earn her place in this house, 1 cup of coffee and 1 split log, and one, because doesn't sound like it looks at a time, that whatever bargain the town had schemed, she'd make her own bargain now on her own terms, in her own time. "Henry," she said, setting down the coffee pot, "after breakfast you're going to show me that schoolhouse your father built, the whole of it, and you're going to tell me true what these children round the valley already know, and what they don't, and which of them can't sit still, and which of them are quick but hide it, and which ones are hungry when they come in the mornings. You know all that, don't you? You know every soul for 10 miles. The boy blinked. It was, she'd wager, the first time in a long while anyone had asked him a question that assumed he knew things worth knowing. "I know 'em," he said slowly. "I thought you might. Then we'll start there." She sat down across from him and folded her hands. "I'm not your mother, Henry. I want that understood between us plain the way your pa and I made things plain last night. I'll never once try to be. Nobody could be, and I'd be a fool to try. But I'm the teacher your father sent for, and I aim to be a good one, and I can't do it without somebody who knows this valley. That somebody is you. So, do we have an arrangement, or don't we?" Henry Walker looked at the Boston woman across his dead mother's table for a long, weighing moment. The whole hard, careful weight of a boy who'd learned too young that people leave. Then he stuck out his hand across the wood, the way he'd seen his father do 100 times, sealing a deal with a neighbor. "We got an arrangement," he said. Clara shook it. His grip was fierce and a little too hard, testing her, and she gripped back just as hard and did not let him see it hurt, and watched the respect come up in his eyes, sudden and real, the way respect comes to boys who've decided the world is against them and are startled to find one person willing to meet them straight. "Good," she said. "Finish your coffee. We've got work." Outside in the cold, bright morning, Thomas Walker stood by the barn and watched through the window as the Boston teacher shook his son's hand across the kitchen table. His son, who hadn't willingly touched a soul in 4 years, who'd sworn at the supper table the night before she came, that he'd not learn one word from any woman the town dragged out here. He watched the boy drink his coffee black and almost smile. He watched the woman he'd offered to send home stand up and roll her sleeves and take hold of his broken household like it was hers to mend. And Thomas Walker, who had not felt one warm thing in 4 years, that he'd let himself feel, who had built his whole life into a wall around a grave, stood in the cold with his hat in his hands, and felt something move in his chest that frightened him half to death. Hope. He set his hat back on his head and turned quick to the stalk before it could get any further hold on him. There was work. There was always work. Work was the thing that had kept him upright these 4 years, and work would keep him upright now, no matter what fool notions a woman's kindness put in a lonely man's head. But he split the kitchen wood small again that night in the dark before anyone could see. And Clara found it in the morning and said nothing and built up the fire. And so it began. Not with a wedding the town had schemed. Not with a bargain struck over cards, but with firewood cut in the dark and coffee poured at dawn, and 2 wounded, guarded, honest people deciding each alone and neither telling the other, that maybe, just maybe, the raw deal life had handed them might yet be made into something neither of them had dared to want. The valley thought it had trapped a Boston teacher into a lonely rancher's house. What it had actually done was bring together the 2 people in all that wide country most likely to understand each other, and neither one of them knew it yet. And both of them were about to spend a good long while pretending they didn't feel it, in the stubborn, silent, hard-won way of people who have learned that the surest road to a broken heart is to admit out loud that you've begun to hope again. Clara Whitfield taught her first day of school that Monday, in the little building Thomas Walker had built board by board for children he was determined would not grow up ignorant. 11 children came from ranches, scattered across 10 miles of grass, and Henry Walker sat in the front row with his arms crossed, daring her to be as good as she'd claimed, and she was, and by noon he'd uncrossed his arms without noticing, and by the end of the week he was correcting the younger children's sums with a fierce proprietary pride, as if the whole school were somehow his doing. And Lucy learned to read because. And in the evenings, the house that had held its breath for 4 years began very slowly, so slowly you'd hardly notice it to breathe. None of them spoke of the town's scheme again. None of them needed to. It sat there between Thomas and Clara, unspoken, every day the lie that had brought her the truth they'd traded in the dark, the word he'd given her, the freedom he'd offered, and she'd refused. It was the ground they stood on. And ground, you've been honest about, even hard ground, even ground somebody tricked you onto, is ground you can build on. They were going to build on it, both of them. Though it would take a storm and a secret worse than the town's, and a moment on a dark road when everything they'd carefully not said came within a breath of being lost forever before either Clara Whitfield or Thomas Walker would find the courage to say the thing they'd both begun to feel that first gray morning over a cup of black coffee and an armload of firewood, split small in the dark. But that was all still coming. For now, there was only this, a Boston teacher who'd decided to stay a silent rancher, learning to hope, a biting boy who'd shaken her hand. A little girl who could finally read the word that didn't sound like it looked. And a house on the wide gold grass of the Montana Territory that was against everything the town had schemed and everything grief had built, becoming one honest day at a time, a home. The first hard frost came the second week of September, and with it came Silas Croft. He rode up to the schoolhouse on a Thursday, just as Clara was ringing the children in from their dinner, a big, loose-jointed man on a good horse, and he sat there in the saddle looking down at her with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You'd be the Walker woman," he said. "I'd be the teacher," Clara said. "Miss Whitfield, can I help you?" "Croft, Silas Croft. I run cattle on the far side of the ridge." He looked past her at the children filing in, and his gaze snagged on Henry a beat too long. "Walker and me have business. Old business. You tell him I came by. Tell him I said the account's still open." He touched his hat, that same smile that was all teeth and no warmth, and turned his horse and rode off. And Clara stood in the schoolhouse door with a cold that had nothing to do with the frost settling into her. She told Thomas that evening. She'd meant to do it gentle, but there wasn't a gentle way, so she just said it plain over the supper dishes after the children had gone to bed. "A man named Croft came to the school today, Silas Croft. Said to tell you the account's still open." The plate in Thomas's hands went still. He set it down very carefully, and when he looked up, his face had closed all the way. The door slammed shut, and something behind it she hadn't seen before, not shame this time, fear. And under the fear, a hard old anger. "He come to the school," Thomas said. "Where my children are." "Yes." "Did he speak to Henry?" "No." He looked at him. "Thomas, who is that man?" Thomas stood and walked to the window and put his hands flat on the frame and looked out at the dark. And for a long moment she thought he wasn't going to answer, that he was going to wall it up the way he walled everything up. But he'd given her his word in the yard that she'd have the truth from him, and Thomas Walker did not break his word, not even when it cost him. "Silas Croft holds paper on this ranch," he said, "near half of it." Clara set down the dish towel. "When Sarah died—" His voice caught on the name the first time she'd heard him say it, and he pushed through it. "When Sarah died, there was the doctor and the burying, and I couldn't work the stock, couldn't do anything but sit for the better part of a season. Lost near the whole herd that winter to cold and neglect. I was drowning. And Croft come to me with money, and I was too broke in the head to see what I was signing. Borrowed against the land at interest that'd make a Boston banker blush. I've been paying it down 4 years. I'm close. Another year, maybe less, and I'd have owned my own ground clear." He turned from the window. "And now he's riding up to the schoolhouse to remind me he can take it whenever he likes. Can he, if I miss a payment, one payment?" Thomas's jaw worked. And he'd like to. He'd like nothing better. Why? And there it was again, the thing behind the fear coming up now, hard and old. "Because he wanted Sarah," Thomas said, "before she was mine. Croft courted her a whole year, and she chose me, a nobody with 40 acres over him with his 400. He never forgave it. Never forgave her, never forgave me. When she died, I half think he saw it as her being taken from us both. And the only piece of her left in this world was this ranch and these children, and he means to have the ranch at least to take from me the one thing she and I built, because it's the closest he can come to taking her." He said it flat, exhausted, a wound so old it had stopped bleeding and gone to bone. "That's the man who rode up to your school today, Miss Whitfield. Now you know why I went pale." Clara stood very still in the lamplight, with all of it settling on her at once, that the house she'd been trapped into wasn't just haunted by grief, but mortgaged to a man who hated the family in it, that the ground under all their careful, honest days was borrowed ground, that Thomas Walker was a year from either owning his life clear or losing all of it. And she understood suddenly and completely why the town had schemed so hard to get him a wife. It wasn't only loneliness they'd worried over. It was this. A man alone, one bad season from ruin with a shark holding his paper. They'd wanted somebody in that house to help him hold on. "How much is the payment?" she said. Thomas blinked. "Ma'am?" "The payment, Thomas. The one you can't miss. How much and when's it due?" "That's not your—" "I'm the teacher your council schemed to plant in this house to keep it from falling apart," Clara said, and her voice had gone hard and clear. "Well, here I am, planted. And I'll not sit at your table eating your food and teaching your boy his letters, while a man threatens your children at my schoolhouse, and I pretend it's none of my concern. How much?" He looked at her a long moment, and something shifted in his face. A man who had carried a thing alone so long, he'd forgotten it was possible not to. $60, he said quietly. 1st of December, and I've got maybe 40 put by with the beef prices down where they are. Then we have until December to find $20, Clara said. We, she said, and picked the dish towel back up and went on drying the plates. And that was the whole of it, but Thomas Walker stood in his kitchen and watched a woman he'd offered to send home take up his oldest, deepest trouble as her own, without being asked, and he had to turn back to the window so she wouldn't see his face. The next weeks turned sharp and cold and fast. Clara had never worked so hard in her life. She taught school 6 days, and in the evenings she took in mending from the valley wives for pennies, a garment her Boston-trained needle earning what it could. She sold 3 of her good dresses to Mrs. Doone, who resold them to a rancher's daughter getting married, and asked no questions about why a young teacher was suddenly parting with her finest things. Every coin went into a tin on the mantel, next to the photograph of the dead woman, and Clara had the strange and not unwelcome feeling dropping her pennies in that Sarah Walker would have approved. Henry noticed. Henry noticed everything. "You're working for the payment," he said one afternoon, walking her back from the school through the cold. "Not a question." "Your father tell you about that?" "My father don't tell me anything. I got ears. Croft's been around my whole life like a buzzard." The boy kicked a stone. "You don't have to. It ain't your ranch." "No," Clara agreed. "It's not." "Then why?" She stopped on the road and looked at him, this hard, careful boy, who'd shaken her hand across his dead mother's table. "Because your father built a schoolhouse board by board so you wouldn't grow up ignorant when he was so broke with grief he could barely stand," she said. "A man who'd do that when the world had given him every reason to do nothing at all. That's a man worth $20 of my mending money, Henry, and you're a boy worth it, and your sister." She started walking again. "That's why. Now stop asking me questions you already know the answers to. It's a bad habit, and I'll break you of it." Henry walked beside her a while in silence, then low, not looking at her. "I could get work. Shoeing at the livery Saturdays. Ferris said he'd take me." "Then take it," Clara said, "and put every cent in the tin. And don't you dare tell your father, or he'll be too proud to allow it. This is our doing, yours and mine. He's carried enough alone." The boy looked up at her, and it was the second time she'd seen respect come up in his eyes. But this time there was something warmer under it, something he hadn't let himself feel toward a grown woman in 4 years. And it scared him, and he covered it by scowling and walking faster. But he took the livery work, and every Saturday night a few more coins went into the tin, and neither of them told Thomas. And it became the first thing they'd ever shared, the boy and the teacher, a conspiracy of kindness against a man too proud to be helped. The twist when it came from Lucy. The little girl had taken to following Clara everywhere, and one gray afternoon while Clara graded slates by the fire, Lucy climbed into her lap. Uninvited the first time she'd done it, and put her head against Clara's shoulder and said dreamy and terrible, in the way only small children can be terrible. Papa keeps Mama's letters in the box under his bed, the wood box. He reads them at night. I hear him. Clara's pencil stopped. He cries. Lucy said, matter of fact, a child reporting weather. Not loud, but I hear it through the wall. Every night, Miss Whitfield. 4 whole years. She yawned. Do you think he'll ever stop being sad? Clara held the little warm weight of her and looked into the fire, and understood in a way she hadn't fully before exactly what she'd walked into. Not a man who was merely quiet. A man who lay in the dark every night of his life, reading a dead woman's letters, and weeping where his children could hear him through the wall. A man drowning so slow and so long he'd forgotten he was drowning. I don't know, she told Lucy honestly, because she'd decided long ago never to lie to this child. But I think being sad and being finished aren't the same thing. I think a person can carry sad a long, long way and still find they've got room for other things too. Glad things. New things. Like you? Lucy asked. Clara's throat went tight. Go get your slate, she said. You've got sums. That night, she heard it herself. She hadn't believed it, not fully, until she lay awake in the small hours and heard through the log wall the low broken sound of a grown man crying as quiet as he could manage, and it went through her like a blade, and she lay rigid in the dark, with her own eyes stinging and her hands in fists, thinking, 4 years. 4 years he's done this and thought no one knew, and his children knew. His babies knew the whole time. She did not go to him. It wasn't her place, and it would have shamed him past bearing. But she lay awake till it stopped. And in the morning, she looked at Thomas Walker, across the coffee, at the careful blank face he put on the face of a man who thought his grief was his own private country, that no one else had ever set foot in. And something in her broke open and reformed harder and more certain. She was going to save this family's ranch if it killed her. And she was going to find a way God knew how to help this man set down the box of letters before it drowned him for good. She didn't get the chance to plan it. Croft moved first. It was the middle of October when the sheriff rode out an apologetic, decent man named Pell, who plainly hated his errand. He handed Thomas a folded paper and wouldn't meet his eyes. Silas filed it this morning, Tom. I'm sorry. He's calling the note early. Says there's a clause acceleration, the lawyer called it. Lets him demand the whole balance if he's got cause to think the property's being let go to ruin. Pell shifted in his saddle, miserable. He's claiming you can't work it proper, what with taking in a woman and a schoolhouse and all. Says you've let the herd go thin. Thomas read the paper. Clara, watching from the porch, saw his hands begin to shake, and saw him make them stop by pure will. How much? Thomas said. The whole balance. How much and how long? $240, Pell said quietly. 30 days. I'm sorry, Tom. I truly am. $240. Clara felt the number land like a blow to the chest. They had in the tin with everything she'd sold, and everything Henry had shoed for, and everything Thomas had scraped, not 60 now, but $91. 91 against 240. In 30 days. The sheriff rode off. Thomas stood in the yard holding the paper, and Henry came out of the barn and stood beside him, and Lucy came to the porch rail, and the whole family stood there in the cold October wind, looking at the piece of paper that was going to take everything from them, and nobody said a word, because in that valley, everyone had learned to carry everything in silence, and here at last was a weight even Clara couldn't think how to lift. Then Thomas did something she'd never seen him do. He laughed, not a good laugh. A terrible one, low and cracked. He waited, he said. He waited 4 years for the exact moment I'd have something to lose again, something besides the ranch. He looked at the three of them, his son, his daughter, the teacher, and Clara understood with a lurch what he meant. Croft had waited until Thomas had a full house again, a life worth wrecking, before he swung the axe. It wasn't only about the land. It was about making sure Thomas felt it. We fight it, Clara said. With what? Thomas's voice was hollow. There's no fightin' a legal note, Miss Whitfield. There's payin' it or losin' the land, and I can't pay it. You can't pay it alone. Woman, there is no— How much would the herd bring? Clara cut in. If you sold at the fall market in Bozeman, every head you could drive. Thomas stopped, frowned. The market's 4 days' drive, and prices are down, and I'd need 3 men to drive it, and I've got no money to hire. How much? He did the arithmetic in his head, and she watched hope and despair war across his face. If I sold near everything, kept back only the breeding stock, I'd need to start again. Maybe 160. Maybe. 160 and 91, Clara said, is 251, which is $11 more than the note. The yard went silent. Thomas stared at her. You'd have me sell the whole herd, he said slowly. Everything Sarah and I built, to pay off Croft, and start over from nothing but breedin' stock and 40 clear acres. I'd have you keep your land, Clara said. Cattle you can raise again, land you can't buy back once he's got it. Sarah didn't build a herd, Thomas. She built a home on that ground. The ground is the thing worth saving. She stepped down off the porch and stood in front of him in the wind. You need men to drive it. Henry can ride. I can cook and keep camp and mind the tally. That's 2 more hands you didn't have. Hire 1 man on the promise of pay from the sale, and you've got your 4. We can do this. But we leave tomorrow because 30 days is no time at all with a 4-day drive each way and a market to hit. Thomas Walker looked at this woman, this Boston schoolteacher the town had tricked into his house, who was standing in his yard, proposing to help drive 400 head of cattle across the Montana Territory in October to save the land his dead wife had loved, and something happened in his face that Clara would remember the rest of her life. The door didn't just crack, it came off its hinges. 4 years of walled-up grief and 4 weeks of walled-up hope broke over him all at once, and for a moment he couldn't speak at all. Why? He finally managed. Why would you do this? Any of it? It's not your fight. It's not your land. You could get on the coach with your $91 and go anywhere. Why stay and drive cattle for a man who split my kitchen wood small in the dark and told his children his son did it? Clara said quietly. Thomas went very still. You think I didn't know? She almost smiled through the terror of the day. You think a woman doesn't know the difference between wood a boy splits and wood a grown man splits? Careful kitchen size for her stove. Every morning, Thomas. 4 weeks. You've been telling me something in firewood you couldn't say in words, and I've been hearing it, and I've been answering you back with coffee and saved suppers and pennies in a tin. And neither one of us has had the courage to say a plain word about it, because we're both so scared of hoping again that we'd rather talk in kindling than out loud. Her voice shook. So here it is out loud. I'm staying. I'm helping. Not because the town schemed it, and not because I've nowhere to go. I could go. You offered me the money. I know I could go. I'm staying because somewhere in these 4 weeks, this stopped being a job and started being— She stopped out of courage at the last, started being mine too. This family, this trouble, this home. I don't know what to call it, and I'm not going to try. But I'm not getting on any coach, and I'm not letting Silas Croft take this ground, and that's the end of it. For a moment, the whole world held its breath. The wind, the children watching, the dead woman's photograph inside on the mantel. Then Thomas Walker crossed the space between them and took both her hands in his big rough ones, the first time he had touched her, and held them, and said in a voice she'd never heard him use, low and cracked open and years deep, Sarah would have liked you. God help me, that's the truth. She'd have liked you fierce. And Clara, who had held herself together through the sheriff and the note and the impossible number, and all of it, felt her eyes spill over, at last standing in a cold October yard, holding the hands of a grieving rancher, while his children watched, and she didn't care who saw. Then let's go keep her land, she said. Tomorrow, first light. They drove out at dawn with 400 head Thomas at point. Henry riding flank like a man twice his age, and glowing with it, a hired man named Deal, bringing up drag, and Clara on the wagon with the camp gear and the tally book, and Lucy bundled beside her because there was no one to leave the child with, and Clara would not have left her anyway. 4 days to Bozeman. 4 days across country that could kill you a dozen ways with a note coming due and a shark waiting to swing his axe. The first day went well, which Thomas said flatly was a bad sign because the first day always went well. He was right. On the second day, the sky went the color of a bruise by noon, and Thomas rode back along the herd, fast shouting to bunch them that a norther was coming, and they had to make the river crossing before it hit, or they'd be pinned on the wrong side for days they didn't have. They didn't make it. The storm came down out of the mountains like the end of the world, and the herd half across the river spooked and split. Half made the far bank, half milled back into the water and the near shore in a bawling, churning panic. And Thomas was in the middle of it on his horse, trying to hold them, and Henry, 12 years old, with something to prove, and a heart too big for his own good, spurred his horse into the river after a knot of calves being swept downstream before anyone could stop him. "Henry!" Thomas's scream tore across the water. The boy's horse went down. Clara was off the wagon and running along the bank before she knew she'd moved Lucy screaming behind her, and she saw the horse come up riderless, and she saw Thomas fling himself off his own mount into the freezing brown current toward the place his son had gone under. And for one endless, horrible moment, there was nothing. Only the roar of the water and the storm and the cattle. And then Thomas came up with a fist knotted in Henry's collar, the boy limp and gray, and began fighting toward the bank against a current that wanted them both dead. Clara waded into her waist, the cold like knives, and grabbed Thomas's outstretched arm, and the hired man Deal grabbed her, and together they hauled father and son out of the river onto the mud, and Thomas rolled the boy over and pounded his back, and Henry vomited river water, and coughed and breathed. Thank God, he breathed. And Thomas clutched his son to his chest in the freezing rain, and made a sound Clara had never heard a man make, half sob and half prayer. "I'm sorry." Henry was gasping. "I'm sorry, Pa, the calves, I was trying to—" "Don't you ever," Thomas choked. "Don't you ever, you hear me? The cattle ain't worth nothing out here is worth, you hear me, boy?" He was shaking Henry and holding him at once. "You're worth more'n every head in this territory. You're worth more'n the land. You hear me? You're your mother's son, and you're all I've." And he couldn't finish. He just held on in the rain on the mud, while the storm screamed around them, and half the herd scattered into the dark. They lost 60 head that night. Scattered, drowned, run off in the storm. 60 head they could not afford to lose. In the morning, gray and freezing, the arithmetic was brutal. Even if they made market with what was left, even at a fair price, they'd come up short of the note. The drive that was meant to save the ranch had cost them the margin that made it possible. They stood in the ruined dawn, soaked and exhausted, and Thomas did the sum aloud in a dead voice, and it came up $30 short at best. And there was nowhere on God's earth to find $30 in the middle of the Montana wilderness, with the market still 2 days off and Croft's clock still running. And it was Henry, wrapped in a blanket still gray from nearly drowning, who spoke. "Croft's got a clause," the boy said hoarsely. They all looked at him. "You said." "That night, the sheriff. Croft's got a clause lets him call it early if the land's being let go to ruin." Henry's teeth were chattering, but his eyes were fierce. "That means there's a paper. A real paper with words on it. And words can be read and words can be argued if a body knows how to read 'em." He looked at Clara. "You read better'n anybody in this valley. Better'n the lawyer, I'd bet. What if the clause don't say what Croft says it says? What if he lied the way this whole valley lies and nobody ever called it because nobody ever read the paper close?" The silence that followed was total. Clara felt something go electric up her spine. "The note," she said slowly. "Thomas, do you have a copy of the note, the actual document you signed?" "In the box," Thomas said. "Under the bed, with Sarah's letters. I keep it all together. It's the only place I—" He stopped. Understanding dawned on his face like a sunrise. It's back at the ranch. Then someone rides back, Clara said, while the rest drive to market. Someone reads that note word by lamplight and finds out whether Silas Croft has any legal right to what he's claiming, or whether he's a bully who's counted for 4 years on you being too broken with grief to ever read the fine print of your own ruin. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Thomas Walker began slowly to laugh, and this time it was not the terrible laugh from the yard. It was something else. It was the laugh of a man who has been drowning for 4 years and has just felt his foot touch bottom. "You," he said to Clara, shaking his head, water still dripping from his hat. "You and my boy. Between the two of you." He wiped his face. "Deal drives the herd on with Henry and me. Bozeman's 2 days. We sell what we've got and pray. And you—" He looked at Clara, and there was something in his eyes now that had traveled a very long way from the closed door of that first afternoon. "You take Lucy and the wagon, and you ride back to the ranch, and you get in the box under my bed, and you read every word of that note like our whole lives depend on it. Because I reckon they do." "I'll need the key," Clara said. "It's not locked." Thomas's voice went quiet, and the whole weight of what he was doing settled over the frozen dawn. "Clara, there's letters in that box. Sarah's letters. I've never let anybody—" He stopped. Started again. "You'll see them. You'll see—" He couldn't finish. He was handing this woman the key to the one locked room of his heart. The box he wept over every night. The country of his grief that he'd let no living soul enter for 4 years. And he was doing it in front of his children in the freezing mud, because a boy who'd nearly drowned had reminded them all that grief could not be allowed to cost them everything. "I'll only read the note," Clara said gently. "I give you my word, Thomas. I won't touch her letters. They're yours. They'll always be yours. I'll read the note and nothing else." And Thomas Walker looked at her a long moment, and then he said the thing that broke the last hinge off the last door quiet, so the children almost didn't hear. "Read them if you want to," he said. I think maybe it's time somebody besides me knew her. Knew what I lost. I've kept her locked in a box under a bed for 4 years like keeping her in the dark could keep her from being gone." His voice cracked wide open. "It didn't work. It never worked. Read them if you want to. I'd like it if you did. I'd like it if somebody else in this world knew Sarah was real." The wind died for a moment. Even Lucy was silent. "Then I'll read them," Clara said softly, "and I'll know her, and I'll tell you what I learn about the woman you loved, and we'll neither of us pretend anymore that she's a secret. She's not a secret, Thomas. She's a mother and a wife who was loved and is missed. That's not a thing to lock in a box. That's a thing to keep in the light." She took the reins of the wagon. "Now, I've got a ride to make and a note to read and a shark to gut. Come here, Lucy. We're going home." She drove out with the child beside her, back the way they'd come toward the ranch and the box under the bed. While behind her, Thomas Walker gathered what was left of his herd and turned it toward Bozeman, with his half-drowned son riding beside him. The boy, taller in the saddle, now changed a boy who'd nearly died, and had in nearly dying found the thing that finally cracked his father's grief, and the thing that might yet save them all. Clara drove hard. Lucy, exhausted, slept against her arm most of the way, and Clara let her, and drove through the cold with her jaw set, and her mind turning over the one thin hope they had left, that somewhere in the fine print of a note signed by a broken man 4 years ago, Silas Croft had overreached the way bullies do when they're sure no one will ever check. She reached the dark, empty ranch near midnight of the second day, and carried the sleeping child in, and put her to bed, and lit the lamp, and went at last into Thomas Walker's room to the box under the bed she'd heard him weep over through the wall for 4 weeks. It was a plain wood box. Her hands shook lifting the lid. On top the note, the legal paper folded in thirds, Thomas's younger, shakier signature at the bottom. Under it, tied with a faded blue ribbon, the letters. Dozens of them. Sarah's letters. Clara set them aside gently with a respect close to reverence, and unfolded the note, and drew the lamp close, and began to read word by careful word, the fine, dense lawyer's script that held the fate of the whole family. And she read it once through, fast, and her heart sank, because it was all there, The debt, the interest, the acceleration clause. Just as the sheriff had said. And then she read it again. Slower. And on the second reading, halfway down the second page, in a subordinate clause, buried in a sentence, 40 words long, Clara Whitfield's Boston-schooled eye caught something, and she stopped and read it a third time, and her breath went out of her all at once. She read it a fourth time, to be sure. She was sure. Silas Croft. 4 years ago, drawing up a note to trap a grieving man, had made one small mistake. The kind of mistake a greedy man makes when he's certain the person signing is too broken to read carefully and too poor to ever hire a lawyer who would. The acceleration clause, the whole basis of his claim. The thing that let him call the note early and demand it all at once, it was conditional. And the condition spelled out in that buried 40-word sentence was one Croft had never met. Clara sat back in the lamplight with the paper in her hands and the dead woman's letters beside her, and the sleeping child in the next room, and out in the dark. 2 days east, her rancher and his boy were driving cattle toward a market that might not save them, and she began quietly in the empty house to laugh and then to cry, because the shark had overreached after all exactly as she'd prayed, and the man who'd waited 4 years to take everything from Thomas Walker had, in his greed and his certainty, handed them the one thing that could stop him cold. She just had to prove it. She had to get this paper in front of the sheriff and maybe a judge before the 30 days ran out. And the 30 days had 8 left. Clara folded the note and she looked a long moment at the blue-ribboned letters. And then, because he'd asked her to, because he'd said, "I'd like it." If somebody else in this world knew Sarah was real. She untied the ribbon with careful fingers and unfolded the topmost letter and began by lamplight in the quiet house to read the words of the dead woman who had loved this land and this man and these children, to know her the way Thomas had asked, so that Sarah Walker need never be a secret, locked in the dark again. The first line stopped her heart. "My dear Thomas," it read in a woman's careful hand. "If you are reading this, then I did not live, and I need you to know 3 things before the grief takes you somewhere I cannot follow." Clara's hands began to tremble. It was not an old love letter. It was written to be read after. Sarah Walker, knowing childbirth might kill her, had left her husband a letter for the after. First, it was not your fault, and I forbid you to carry it. Second, our children must not grow up in a house of mourning. You must let joy back in Thomas. You must promise me you will not turn our home into my grave. And third, my love. My stubborn, silent love. Clara read the last line and put her hand to her mouth and understood that she was holding in her hands the very words that might finally set Thomas Walker free, words he had wept over for 4 years without ever perhaps truly hearing when the time comes. And it will come. Do not be too proud or too afraid to love again. I would rather you happy with another than faithful to a grave. Fill this house, Thomas. That is my last wish. Fill this house. Clara Whitfield sat in the lamplight with the dead woman's last wish in one hand and the shark's fatal mistake in the other. And outside, the wind moved over the wide dark grass, and 8 days remained, and she knew with a certainty that went all the way to the bone. Exactly what she had to do, and exactly what she had to say to Thomas Walker when he came home from Bozeman, whether the herd had sold or not, whether the note was beaten or not, because some things could no longer wait, and some things locked too long in the dark had to be brought at last into the light. She placed the letter and the note side by side on the table where he would see them both the moment he walked through the door. Then she banked the fire and checked on the sleeping child and sat down to wait for the sound of hooves in the yard and the return of the man whose whole life was about to change one way or the other in the 8 days that were left. He came home on the 5th night, and Clara heard the wagon before she saw it, and she was at the door with the lamp before Thomas had set the brake. She knew from his face. Even in the dark, even exhausted, she knew. It hadn't gone well enough. "We sold," he said, climbing down slow every movement of a man who'd ridden 4 days and slept 2 hours. "Every head we had left. Deal took his pay and rode on to Helena." He held up a canvas sack. $131, Clara. That's what a lifetime of cattle come to at this market in this year. He set the sack on the porch rail like it burned him. 91 in the tin, 131 in the sack, $222, and the note's 240. He said it flat, the way a man says a thing he said to himself 100 miles running. $18 short, after everything. After the herd and the storm and Henry near drownin'. $18. Where's Henry? Sleepin' in the wagon bed. Wouldn't leave my side the whole drive. Something moved in his voice, wet and proud. That boy rode drag through 2 days of rain and never complained once. He grew up on that trail, Clara. I watched it happen. I watched my son become a man on the trail that's about to lose us everything. His voice broke on the last word, and he turned away ashamed and put his hands on the rail and bowed his head. And Clara saw that Thomas Walker, who had held himself together through a dead wife and 4 years of grief and a storm that nearly took his boy, was about to break at last over $18. "Thomas," she said, "come inside. There's nothing inside but a house I'm about to lose." "Come inside," Clara said again, and something in her voice made him lift his head. "There are 2 pieces of paper on that table you need to read. And when you've read them, you're going to feel very differently about the number 18. He looked at her a long moment. Then he went in. She'd laid them side by side, just as she'd meant to, the note and the letter. Thomas saw the note first, and his jaw tightened. Then he saw the other paper, and he went very still, because he knew that hand. He'd know that hand, blind and dying, and he looked up at Clara with something close to fear. "You read her letters. You told me to," Clara said gently. "In the mud at the river. You said you'd like it if somebody else knew Sarah was real. I only read the first one, Thomas, the one on top, and I need you to read it again, right now, because I don't think you ever truly read it. I think you've wept over it 4 years without once letting the words in. Read it, out loud, for me." Thomas Walker's hands shook as he picked up his dead wife's letter. He'd held it 1,000 nights. He had never once read it aloud. And now, in his kitchen with the teacher watching and his son asleep in the wagon, and $18 standing between him and ruin, he began to read Sarah's last words out loud for the first time in 4 years, and his voice came apart on the very first line. "My dear Thomas," he read, "if you are reading this, then I did not live." He stopped, pressed the back of his hand to his mouth, went on. "And I need you to know 3 things before the grief takes you somewhere I cannot follow." His shoulders were shaking now. "First, it was not your fault, and I forbid you to carry it." "Keep reading," Clara said softly. "Second, our children must not grow up in a house of mourning. You must let joy back in. Thomas, you must. Promise me you will not turn our home into my grave." The paper was trembling so hard he could barely see it. "And third, my love, my stubborn, silent love." His voice failed completely. He couldn't. He shook his head, tears running openly now down a face that had shown nothing for 4 years. Clara crossed to him and put her hand over his on the paper and finished it herself quietly. The words she'd read a dozen times, waiting for him. "When the time comes, and it will come, do not be too proud or too afraid to love again. I would rather you happy with another than faithful to a grave. Fill this house, Thomas. That is my last wish. Fill this house." The silence in the kitchen was total. "The Vaiho. 4 years," Thomas whispered. 4 years I read that letter every night, and I only ever heard the first part. The part where she's gone. I never once—" His voice cracked wide. She told me to be happy. She told me to love again. She gave me leave right there in her own hand the night she died, and I locked it in a box and wept over the wrong half of it for 4 years. He looked up at Clara, wrecked wide open, a man who'd carried a stone so long he'd forgotten it was a stone and not his own bones. "I've been faithful to a grave, and she begged me not to be. My Sarah begged me not to be, and I didn't hear her." "You hear her now?" Clara said. "I hear her now." For a moment, neither of them moved, and the whole 4 years, and the whole 4 weeks, and the whole terrible drive and the storm, and the boy in the river, and the firewood split small in the dark, and the coffee at dawn, All of it hung suspended in that kitchen, gathered to a single point, and Clara Whitfield stood with her hand over Thomas Walker's hand over his dead wife's blessing. And she thought now, it has to be now, or it never will be. But it was Thomas who spoke first. Clara. He turned his hand over under hers, so their palms met. I'm about to lose this ranch. In 3 days, a man's going to ride out here and take everything Sarah and I built, and I'll have nothing to my name but a wagon and 2 children and 40 acres he'll take next. I've got no right to say to you what I want to say. A man with nothing has no right to ask a woman for anything. His grip tightened. But Sarah told me not to be too proud. So I'm going to say it even ruined, even broke even with nothing to offer but trouble. I don't want you to teach my children and keep your own counsel and say only good morning and good night. I never wanted that. From the first week I've been splitting that wood small so I'd have some way to tell you a thing I hadn't the courage to say. And I'm saying it now before I lose the last thing that makes me worth saying it to. I've fallen in love with you, Clara Whitfield. God help me. In 4 weeks, like a green boy. And I've got no earthly right to, and no home to offer you, and I'm saying it anyway. And Clara, who had come west with a broken engagement and a scattered family, and a future dissolved to nothing, who had been tricked into this house by a lying town, who had sold her dresses and hidden pennies in a tin, and driven cattle through a storm, and read a dead woman's blessing by lamplight. Clara Whitfield looked at this broken, honest man, and felt 4 weeks of held breath go out of her all at once. You fool, she said, and she was laughing and crying at once. You beautiful, stubborn, silent fool. Do you think I sold my grandmother's dresses for a job? Do you think I stood waist deep in a freezing river for a wage? I've been in love with you since the morning I found that firewood and knew you'd lied to your own son about cutting it so I wouldn't know it was you. I've loved you for weeks and been too scared to say it because the last man I loved threw me over for a richer woman, and I swore I'd never hand my heart to anyone again. She took his face in both her hands. But Sarah's right. Your Sarah is right, Thomas. I'd rather be poor with you on 40 clear acres than rich and safe and lonely anywhere on this earth. So you listen to me. We are not losing this ranch. Do you hear me? Read the other paper? He blinked. What? The note. Thomas, read the note. I've been trying to tell you since you walked in the door, but you keep breaking my heart, and I keep letting you. Read the acceleration clause. Read it out loud the way you read the letter. Bewildered, wrung out, still holding her, Thomas picked up the legal paper and found the clause and began to read the dense lawyer's script, and Clara watched his face, and she watched the moment it landed. Watched him hit the buried 40-word sentence, and stop, and read it again, and go rigid. Man, provided that the holder shall have given written notice of deficiency. He read slowly, and allowed the borrower a period of 90 days to cure said deficiency before invoking the right of acceleration. He looked up white. 90 days. 90 days, Clara said. Silas Croft never gave you written notice of a single deficiency, Thomas. Did he? No letter, no paper, nothing. He sent the sheriff with a demand for the whole balance in 30 days. But his own note, the note he wrote himself to trap you so sure you'd never read it, his own note says he can't accelerate anything until he's first given you written notice and then waited 90 days for you to fix it. He skipped his own step. He was so certain a grieving man would never read the fine print that he didn't bother to follow it himself. Her voice rang in the little kitchen. His claim isn't just weak, Thomas. It's void. He has no legal right to call this note early. None. He never met the condition in his own contract. The 30 days is a bluff. It always was. Thomas Walker stared at the paper in his hands. You're sure, he said. Clara, you're sure. Because if I ride into town and stand in front of Pell and I'm wrong. I read it 11 times, Clara said. By lamplight. I was a schoolteacher in Boston, Thomas. I've read harder documents than a frontier shark's greedy little note. He overreached. Greedy men always overreach. They can't help it, they're so sure of themselves. He built his whole 4-year plan on the certainty that you'd never once read your own contract. And he was almost right. But he didn't count on the fact that you'd taken a Boston teacher who reads for a living, and he didn't count on your son near drowning and reminding us all that words on paper can be read and argued. She took the note from his hands. You are not $18 short of ruin Thomas Walker. You are 3 days out from making Silas Croft the biggest fool in this valley. And Thomas Walker began for the 3rd time that night to weep. But this time not from grief and not from love, but from something he'd forgotten the taste of entirely 4 years buried under a stone relief. Pure, staggering relief. He sat down hard in the kitchen chair and put his face in his hands, and his shoulders shook, and Clara stood behind him and put her arms around him and held him, this big, broken, honest man, while 4 years of drowning finally let go. There's more, she said quietly when he'd stilled. The note's void as to acceleration, but you still owe him the money over time on the original terms. He'll come after that. And Thomas, a man like Croft humiliated in front of the whole valley, made a fool of having waited 4 years, he's not going to take it quiet. He wanted this ranch because it's the last of Sarah in this world. When he can't take it legal, he may try to take it another way. We've beaten his paper. We have not beaten him. You understand that? Thomas wiped his face and looked up at her, and something hard and steady came into him. The man who could repair fences in a storm. The man who'd pulled his son out of a river. I understand it, he said. But there's a difference now, Clara. 4 years I fought everything alone. Croft, the grief, the ranch, the children, all of it alone. I don't fight alone anymore. He stood and took her hands. I've got a partner now. If she'll have a man with 40 acres and a lawsuit coming and 2 children and a whole lot of trouble, she'll have him, Clara said. God knows why, she'll have him. They rode into Miller's Crossing the next morning, all of them, Thomas and Clara on the wagon seat and Henry and Lucy in the back, and they went straight to the sheriff's office, and Thomas laid the note on Pell's desk and said, Read the clause, Amos, the acceleration clause. Read it careful. Pell read it, and Clara watched the decent, tired sheriff's face change, and watched him read it again, and watched him sit back slow. Well, I'll be damned, Pell said quietly. 90 days written notice to cure. He never gave you any notice, Tom. He sent me out here with a 30-day demand. He looked up. This note don't let him accelerate. Not without he does the 90 days first, and he never did. A slow, grim smile started at the corner of the sheriff's mouth, a man who'd hated his errand and was about to enjoy its undoing. Silas Croft wrote himself a clause, and then forgot to obey his own paper, because he never figured you'd read it. My wife read it, Thomas said. It came out before he'd thought about it. My wife, and Clara's breath caught, and Henry's head came up in the back of the room, and Lucy said, Miss Whitfield's going to be our mama, in a voice loud enough to be heard on the street, and Thomas Walker went red to the ears and didn't take it back. She's not yet, he said gruffly. But she will be if she'll still have me after I said it out loud in front of the sheriff before I'd rightly asked her proper. Ask her proper later, Pell said dryly. Right now you've got a bigger problem, Tom, and I'd not do my job if I didn't tell you. Croft's not going to like this. Word'll be all over the valley by supper that the Walker note's void and Silas got made a fool by an Eastern schoolteacher. A man like that. The sheriff's smile faded. He's carried a grudge 4 years, and he's about to have it thrown in his face public. I've known Silas Croft a long time. He don't lose graceful. You watch your stock, you watch your barn, and you watch those children. The warning sat cold over all of them on the ride home, and it turned out to be a good warning, because the trouble came that very night. Clara woke to Henry shaking her shoulder, his face white in the dark. Miss Whitfield, Clara, wake up. There's a light in the far pasture. Fire. Something's burnin'. She was up and moving before she was fully awake. Thomas was already pulling on his boots, and Clara saw through the window the orange glow low against the black hills, and knew what it was even before Thomas said it low and terrible. The hay barn! He's burnin' my winter feed! Thomas grabbed his rifle from over the door. "Every scrap of hay I've got to carry my breedin' stock through the winter. Without it they starve, and I lose them too, and he takes the ranch anyway when I can't pay note or no note." He was at the door. "Stay in the house. Bar it. Keep the children. I'm coming with you. Clara, I'm coming with you." "Thomas Walker, we don't fight alone anymore. You said it yourself not 12 hours ago, and I'll not sit in a house and watch our winter burn. Henry, bar the door behind us and keep your sister away from the windows, and don't you open it for anyone but us. Do you understand me?" "I understand," Henry said, and for once didn't argue, and Clara saw in his face that the boy who'd nearly drowned understood exactly what was at stake, and that some hard, true thing had settled into him on that trail that would never leave. They ran for the barn through the freezing dark, and the fire was bad and getting worse, and Thomas was cursing and beating at the burning edge of the hay with a wet sack, and Clara was hauling water from the trough, and for a few desperate minutes it seemed they might beat it. And then a shape moved at the edge of the firelight, and a voice came out of the dark, and it was Silas Croft, and he was holding a torch. And there was a wildness in his face that 4 years of patient hate had finally burned down to. "Evenin' Walker," Croft said. "Evenin' Schoolteacher." His eyes went to Clara, and there was something in them that made Thomas step in front of her without thinking. "Heard you read my note real close? Heard you made me look a fool in front of Amos Pell and half the county." He turned the torch slow in his hand. "Well, if I can't have this ground legal, I reckon I'll just have to make sure there's nothing left on it worth having. Startin' with the feed, then the house. Then we'll see." "Silas!" Thomas's voice was low, steady, the rifle in his hands but not raised. "You put out that torch and ride home, and this ends here. Arson's a rope, Silas. You know it is. Pell'll hang you for this, and no note in the world'll matter to a dead man. You think I care?" And there it was, the thing under 4 years of grudge breaking open at last. And it was grief, Clara realized with a jolt. It was the same grief that had drowned Thomas, only Croft had let his rot instead of weep. "You think I care about a rope? She's gone, Walker. Sarah's gone, and you got to have her 12 years, and I never got one. And then she dies bringing your child into the world, and you get to keep the children and the land and the memory and everything. And I got nothing. I got 4 years of riding past this ranch, knowing every acre of it was hers, and every stone of it was yours, and I got—" His voice cracked, and the torch shook. "I got nothing. And now you're going to marry some school teacher and fill her house up with a new woman like Sarah never— She told me to." The words fell into the firelight and stopped Croft dead. "Sarah," Thomas said. "In her last letter, the night she died, she told me to love again, to fill the house, not to be faithful to a grave." He lowered the rifle all the way and set it against the barn wall and stood there empty-handed in front of a madman with a torch. "You loved her, Silas. I know you did. I've known it 20 years, and I'm sorry. I am. I got 12 years, and you got none, and that's a cruelty no man should have to swallow. But burnin' my feed won't bring her back. Killin' me won't bring her back. And I'll tell you something you don't want to hear." His voice was steady and gentle, and it was the voice of a man who had climbed all the way out of the same pit Croft was drowning in and was reaching a hand back down into it. "She'd be ashamed of you. Right now. This minute. The Sarah you loved would look at what you've become, a man burnin' out a widower and threatenin' his children out of spite, and she would be ashamed, Silas. That's not grief. That's poison. I know because I let the same poison near kill me, and it took this woman here and my own boy near drownin' in a river to pull me out of it. Put out the torch. For her sake. For the woman we both loved. Put it out." Dilt. The barn burned. Croft stood with the torch shaking in his hand, and Clara watched a man teetering on the last edge of himself. Watched 4 years of rotted grief, war with something older and better underneath it. And she did the only thing she could think to do. She stepped out from behind Thomas. Slow, her hands open and empty, and she spoke to Silas Croft in the voice she used for frightened children. "Mr. Croft," she said. "I read her letters. All of them. Not just the last one." It wasn't quite true she'd read the first and then honored her word, but she'd read enough of Sarah Walker in that one letter to know the woman, and she gambled everything on it now. She wrote about you, once. Croft went rigid. She wrote that she'd made her choice and never regretted it, but that she prayed you'd find happiness too, because you were a good man once before the bitterness took you. She hoped for you, Mr. Croft. The woman you loved spent some of her last thoughts hoping you'd find peace. What do you think she'd want you to do with that torch? It was the cruelest kind thing Clara had ever done, and it worked. Silas Croft made a sound like something breaking, and the torch dropped from his hand into the mud, and he sank down after it onto his knees in the firelight. And he wept, a hard, bitter, ugly weeping, 4 years of it, the tears of a man who'd loved a woman he couldn't have, and let it turn him into something he despised. And Thomas Walker, who had every reason on earth to let him kneel there and then hand him to the sheriff for a rope, instead picked up the wet sack and pressed it into Clara's hands and said, "Help me put out the fire." And then he walked over to the weeping man who'd tried to burn him out, and he crouched down beside him in the mud, and he put a hand on Silas Croft's shaking shoulder. "Come on," Thomas said quietly. "Help us save the feed. And then we'll talk, you and me, about how a man puts down a thing he's carried too long. I know the way of it now. I'll show you." He gripped the shoulder harder. "We both loved her, Silas. That makes us something to each other whether we like it or not. Come on, get up. Help me put out this fire." And Silas Croft, who had ridden out in the dark to destroy the Walker Ranch, got to his feet and picked up a bucket and helped Thomas Walker and Clara Whitfield put out the fire he'd set. And they saved better than half the hay enough with careful management to carry the breeding stock through, and by the time the gray dawn came up over the wide grass, the three of them stood soot-black and exhausted and alive in front of a scorched but standing barn, and something impossible had happened in the night. Something none of them could have predicted, a hate 4 years deep. Broken not by a rifle or a rope, but by a dead woman's mercy passed from one grieving man to another. Croft rode home at dawn. Before he went, he sat his horse a long moment looking down at Thomas. "The note," he said gruffly. I'll redraw it. Fair terms, no acceleration, time to pay it honest." He couldn't look at Clara. "It's the least. After this." He worked his jaw. "I'm sorry, Walker. For the fire. For all of it. 4 years of it." And then so low they almost didn't hear "thank you." For what you said. About her hoping for me. I don't know that I believe it. But I needed to hear it. Clara said nothing. She had told a lie to save a family, and she'd carry it, and she thought Sarah Walker would forgive her the lie for the sake of the mercy in it. Some lies are truer than the truth. She'd decided that a long time ago teaching frightened children in Boston and the frontier hadn't changed her mind. Croft rode off. Thomas watched him go, and then he turned to Clara and to Henry and Lucy, who'd come out onto the porch when the danger passed, and he stood in the sooty dawn in front of his scorched barn, and his ruined winter, and his saved ranch, and his whole gathered family, and he looked like a man who had set down a stone he'd carried so long he'd forgotten the weight of it until it was gone. "Clara Whitfield," he said. "Thomas, I said it in front of the sheriff before I asked you proper, and Lucy's been calling you her mama all day, and I reckon the whole valley'll have us married by supper whether we do it or not." He took off his hat. Soot-black, exhausted 40 years old, and just come through fire, he stood there and did the thing 4 years of grief had told him he'd never do again. "So I'm asking you proper now in front of my children and God and the ranch we near lost and saved together. Will you marry me? Not to teach the children, though you're the finest teacher this valley's ever seen. Not because the town schemed it, though I reckon they'll take credit till the day they die. But because Sarah told me to fill this house, and there's not another soul on this earth I'd fill it with. Will you have me, Clara, broke and sooty and stubborn as I am? And Clara Whitfield, 2,000 miles from a Boston that was finished with her standing in front of a scorched barn beside a man who'd pulled his son from a river and a shark from a pit. With a hard-shelled boy and a bright-eyed girl watching from the porch, and a dead woman's blessing folded in a box that no longer needed to stay in the dark, opened her mouth to say yes, say, and Lucy got there first, shrieking, "Say yes, say yes, say yes," and Henry, 12 years old and too cool for any of it, muttered, "Just say yes so we can go to bed. We've been up all night." And Clara started laughing and crying, and she crossed the muddy, sooty yard and took Thomas Walker's sooty face in her hands, the way she had in the kitchen. And she said the word she'd traveled 2,000 miles in 4 weeks and one long, terrible night of fire to arrive at. "Yes," she said. "You stubborn, silent, wonderful man. Yes. 100 times yes. I'll marry you, and I'll teach your children, and I'll fill this house till it can't hold another blessed thing. Yes." And Thomas Walker kissed her in the gray dawn in front of his children and his scorched barn and the whole wide indifferent grass of the Montana Territory. And it was the first time in 4 years he'd kissed anyone. And Lucy cheered, and even Henry cracked a smile he couldn't quite kill. And the house that had held its breath for 4 years, finally at long last, let it out. But the thing about a house that's been holding its breath so long is that when it finally breathes, all the ghosts come up at once. And that afternoon, when the exhaustion had them all sleeping, and Clara couldn't, she went walking to clear her head out past the scorched barn toward the hill that overlooked the whole ranch. And there on the hill, under a single crooked pine, she found something she hadn't known was there. A grave, a small weathered wooden marker, and carved into it in Thomas Walker's own rough hand, 2 names, not one: Sarah Walker and infant son. Clara stood on the hill in the cold afternoon light and read the marker twice, and understood with a slow, terrible dawning that there was one more secret in this family. One more thing locked away. One thing. Thomas had never said in 4 weeks of firewood and honesty, and one long night of fire. Lucy was 8. Lucy had been born 4 years ago, but the grave said infant son. Sarah Walker had died in childbirth 4 years ago, bringing a son into the world, a son who had also died, and Lucy the little girl who followed Clara. Everywhere, the little girl who could finally read, because the little girl who'd been calling Clara her mama all day long. Lucy was 8 years old, born 4 years before the grave on the hill. Which meant Lucy was not the child who had killed Sarah Walker, which meant that somewhere in the story Thomas had told her the story. The whole valley believed the story of a man who lost his wife bringing his youngest into the world. Something was not true. Something had been buried on this hill with Sarah and her infant son. Something Thomas Walker had let the whole world believe for 4 years, something even his own daughter believed. And Clara stood over the grave with the wind moving through the crooked pine, and felt the ground she'd only just found solid tilt once more beneath her feet, because she had agreed to marry a man whose deepest grief, it turned out, was not the grief she'd thought at all. And whatever the truth of that grave was, Thomas Walker had guarded it more fiercely than the note, more fiercely than the letters, more fiercely than anything, for 4 long years. And she was going to have to ask him, before the wedding, before she filled that house. She was going to have to climb down off this hill and look the man she loved in the eye and ask him what really happened 4 years ago, and whose child Lucy truly was, and what he had buried up here that he'd let even his own daughter misunderstand. Clara Whitfield turned from the grave and started down the hill toward the house, toward Thomas, toward the last locked door in a family full of them, and she did not yet know that the answer waiting behind it would be the hardest and most beautiful thing she had heard in all her days on the frontier. She found him at the corral mending the gate the fire had scorched, and she stood there with the question in her throat like a stone, and Thomas took one look at her face and set down his tools, slow. "You went up the hill," he said. "I did." "You read the marker?" "I did, Thomas." He nodded once. The way he'd nodded when the sheriff came a man taking a blow he'd been waiting years to take. He wiped his hands on his trousers, and he looked out at the grass a long moment, and Clara let the silence sit, because she'd learned that this man told his truths in his own time, or not at all. "You want to know why the grave says son," he said finally, "and Lucy's 8 years old, and both those things can't be true the way the valley tells it. I want to know whatever you'll tell me. But Thomas, I've agreed to marry you. I'm going to fill this house with you like Sarah asked. If there's a thing buried on that hill that I'm going to be living beside the rest of my life, I'd rather know it from your mouth than find it out sideways the way I found out I was tricked into coming here at all. He looked at her, and something in him decided all at once the way a dam decides. "Sit down," he said, and she sat on the corral rail, and Thomas Walker told her the last secret, the one under all the others, the one he'd never told a living soul. "Lucy's not mine," he said. Clara went still, "Not by blood." He said it fast, then slower, the words coming easier once the first one was out. Sarah had a sister, younger, wild, ran off to Helena when she was 17, took up with a man who wasn't worth spit, and 4 years into it, she showed up at our door one winter night with a baby in her arms, and no wedding ring, and no man, and no place to go. That baby was Lucy. She was 4 years old. He shook his head. Sarah's sister, her name was Ruth. She was sick. Consumption. She'd come home to die, and she knew it, and she'd come to ask Sarah to take the child, because there wasn't another soul in the world who'd have her a fallen woman's baby. And Sarah... His voice went thick. Sarah didn't hesitate, not 1 second. She took Lucy up in her arms, and she said, "She's ours now. She was always going to be ours." And Ruth died in our back room 3 weeks later, and we buried her quiet, and Sarah and I raised Lucy as our own from that night. And we never told a soul she wasn't born to us, because Sarah said a child like that in a valley like this, they'd never let her forget where she came from. So we gave her a clean start. Far as the valley knows, far as Lucy herself knows, she's Sarah's own daughter and mine. Aye. Clara's throat had gone tight. "And the grave, the son." Thomas was quiet a long moment. 4 years ago, he said. When Lucy was 4 and Henry was 8, Sarah got with child again. Our own this time, Henry's. Lucy's a brother for both of them. And she was so happy, Clara. I never saw her happier. She said now the family was complete. Now Lucy'd have a brother by blood to grow up with, same as Henry. Now nobody could ever say Lucy wasn't wove all the way into this family. His hands had gone white on the rail. And the birth went wrong. It went so wrong. The baby came too early and turned the wrong way. And there was no doctor closer than a day's ride, and I couldn't. I sat there, and I couldn't do anything but hold her hand and watch. We lost the baby that night, our son. And we lost Sarah by morning, both of them. And I buried them together up on that hill under the pine, the wife I loved, and the son I never got to know. And I put both their names on the marker because they went together, and I couldn't bear to part them even in the ground. Clara had both hands pressed to her mouth. So when the valley says Thomas Walker lost his wife bringing his youngest into the world, he said they've got it half right. I lost Sarah bringing a child into the world, but the child wasn't Lucy. Lucy was already 4 and already ours. The child was our son, and he died with his mother, and he's up on that hill, and nobody in this valley knows he ever existed at all because I never told them. I let them think Lucy was the baby that cost me Sarah. I let my own daughter grow up thinking her birth is what... His voice broke clean in half. What killed the woman she calls her mother. Because the truth was worse. The truth was there was a son and he's dead, and Lucy's not even... Lucy is your daughter, Clara said fiercely, and she was off the rail and gripping his arms. Don't you dare finish that sentence, Thomas Walker. Blood or no blood, that child is yours. You raised her. You built a schoolhouse so she wouldn't grow up ignorant. You split firewood in the dark, and you pulled her out of every trouble she ever fell into, and she calls you Papa, and she means it all the way down. Lucy is your daughter. Sarah made her your daughter the night she took her up and said, she's ours now. And death didn't undo that, and it never will. I let her believe she killed her mother. The words came out of him like they were tearing free of bone. Every time that child asks if missing someone gone forever is normal, she thinks she's the reason. She thinks her being born is why Sarah's not here. And I never corrected it because correcting it meant telling her she's not ours by blood. And I was too much a coward, and so I let her carry a guilt that isn't even hers to carry, that isn't even true. He was coming apart now, 4 years of it, the last stone, The heaviest one, the one under all the others. I've done my little girl a wrong every single day for 4 years, and I didn't know how to undo it without doing her a worse one, and it's ate at me every night in that box with Sarah's letters, and I never told a soul, and now you know, and I don't know what to do with it, Clara. I've carried it so long I don't know how to set it down." And Clara Whitfield stood in the corral holding a man who had just handed her the single heaviest thing he owned, and she understood with a clarity that went all the way to the bone that this was the real reason the town had never been able to marry Thomas Walker off. Not the silence, not the grief they could see. It was this grief, the one they couldn't see, the one he'd buried so deep that no ordinary woman could have reached it. It had taken a Boston teacher who read for a living, and a boy who nearly drowned, and a fire in the night, and a dead woman's blessing brought up into the light to get this far. And now, here it was, the last locked door, and Thomas Walker had opened it, and he was standing in the doorway of it, shaking, waiting to see if she'd run. "You're going to set it down," Clara said, "the same way you set down the rest of it, in the light, where it can't drown you anymore." "How?" "You're going to tell Lucy the truth." Thomas went white. "I can't. Clara, I can't do that to her. To tell her she's not, that Sarah wasn't her real, it'd break her clean apart. She's 8 years old." "You're going to tell her the truth that matters," Clara said. "Not all of it. Not the way you'd tell a grown woman she's a child, and some truths you feed a child in spoonfuls, not all at once. But the part she needs, Thomas, the part that's killing her, that her birth did not cause anyone's death. That she is not the reason her mother is gone. You can give her that today. This afternoon. You can lift a guilt off that little girl's shoulders that she never should have carried one single day. And you can do it without telling her one thing that isn't true. Because it is true. Lucy did not kill Sarah. That's not a lie you'd be telling her. It's a truth you've been withholding for 4 years. Thomas stared at her. The rest, that she's Ruth's daughter, that Sarah took her up out of love and not out of birth, that can wait until she's grown enough to hear it as the beautiful thing it is instead of the frightening thing it'd be to a child. And when that day comes, you won't tell her alone. I'll be there. We'll tell her together, and we'll tell her that being chosen is a deeper thing than being born. That Sarah looked at a baby that wasn't hers and loved her so hard, she made her hers. And that's not a lesser way to be a daughter, Thomas. It's a greater one. But that's for later. Today, you go find your little girl, and you take that guilt off her, because no child should go one more night believing she's the reason her mother died when it isn't even true." For a long moment, Thomas Walker couldn't speak at all. And then he said, hoarse-wrecked, wondering, Sarah would have known exactly how to do this. She always knew. And I've been so lost without her I couldn't even see the way to unhurt my own child." He looked at Clara like a man seeing land after a long time at sea. "And now here you are, saying the exact thing she'd have said. 4 weeks off a coach from Boston." "I'm not Sarah," Clara said gently. "I'll never be Sarah, and I'd never try, and Lucy needs to know that too someday. But I love that little girl, Thomas. I've loved her since she asked me who salted the ocean. And I'll not stand by and watch her carry a lie one more day when the truth would set her free. Go get her. I'll come with you. You won't do it alone. You don't do anything alone anymore, remember? You told Silas Croft his own self in the firelight. You don't fight alone." They found Lucy on the porch dressing a corn-husk doll, and Thomas sat down on the step beside her, and Clara sat on her other side, and Henry, who'd been splitting kindling nearby, drifted close without being asked, because Henry always knew when something in the family was about to shift. "Lucy Bug," Thomas said, and his voice shook, and the little girl looked up because he only called her that when it was serious. "I got to tell you something. Something I should have told you a long, long time ago, and I didn't because I was scared, and that was wrong of me." "Am I in trouble?" Lucy asked small. "No. No, baby, you're not in trouble. You're the furthest thing from trouble there ever was." He took a breath. "Lucy, you know your mama died a long time ago. And I know somewhere in that head of yours you've wondered if it was your fault. If you being born is why she's not here." Lucy's face went very still, and her eyes filled, and she looked down at the doll, and in the smallest voice Clara had ever heard, she said, "Henry said the baby is what made Mama go to heaven, and I was the baby. No." Thomas took his daughter by both shoulders and turned her to face him, and there were tears running down the man's face, and he didn't hide them. "Listen to me. Listen good, because this is the truest thing I'll ever tell you. You did not make your mama go to heaven. You didn't. That is not what happened, Lucy. Not one bit of it. Your mama loved you more than the whole sky, and you being born was the happiest day of her whole life, and whatever you thought, whatever you feared, whatever anybody said, it is not your fault that she's gone. It never was. Do you hear me? It was never ever your fault. I should have told you that 4 years ago, and I'm so sorry I didn't, and I'm telling you now, and I need you to believe it all the way down to your toes. You are not the reason. You were only ever the joy." Lucy looked at her father, and looked at the tears on his face, and something 4 years old and terrible and heavy came off the child's shoulders, right there on the porch. Clara watched it go, watched the little body change, watched a guilt no 8-year-old should ever have carried, lift and float away on the afternoon wind. And Lucy threw herself into her father's arms and sobbed, and Thomas held her and rocked her and said, "Not your fault, not your fault, never your fault," over and over into her hair, like a prayer he'd been saving 4 years to say. And Henry, who'd told his little sister the cruel thing years ago, the way children do, not knowing what it would grow into. Henry stood at the edge of the porch with his own face crumpling, and he said, "Lucy, I'm sorry I didn't. I didn't know it wasn't true. I was little too. I'm sorry." And Lucy reached out one arm from their father's embrace and pulled her brother in, and the three of them held on the whole broken remnant of the family Sarah Walker had built and left behind. And Clara Whitfield sat beside them on the porch step, with her own face wet, and did not intrude, because some circles a person joins by staying just outside them until they widen to make room. And then Lucy's small, muffled voice came from the middle of the pile. "Miss Whitfield, Clara, come in. You're supposed to be in too if you're going to be our mama." And the circle widened and made room, and Clara went into it. They were married 11 days later in the little schoolhouse Thomas had built, board by board, and the whole valley came, because in a country that lonesome, a wedding is everyone's business and everyone's joy. Mrs. Doone cried. Sheriff Pell gave the bride away, having appointed himself to the office on the grounds that somebody decent ought to, and there being no one else. Lucy carried wildflowers and dropped most of them and didn't care. Henry stood up beside his father as best man, 12 years old and solemn as a judge, and when the preacher asked who blessed this union, it was Henry who spoke unprompted in a voice that cracked halfway and finished strong. "My ma did, before she went. She said, 'Fill the house,' so we're filling it." And there wasn't a dry eye in the schoolhouse. Silas Croft came. Nobody expected it. He stood at the very back hat in his hands, and he didn't say much, and he left before the dancing. But before he left, he came up to Thomas and Clara, and he put an envelope in Thomas's hand, and he said gruff, not meeting their eyes, "The note, paid in full. Consider it a wedding gift, and an apology I don't rightly know how to say out loud." He worked his jaw. She'd have liked this, Sarah. A house getting filled up again instead of emptied out. I reckon I've spent 4 years wantin' the wrong thing, wantin' to take when she'd have wanted me to. He couldn't finish. He put his hat on. "Be happy, Walker, both of you. God knows somebody in this valley ought to be." And he was gone. And Thomas stood there holding a paid-in-full note that had nearly cost him everything, and Clara watched a 4-year hate finish dying in the doorway of a schoolhouse, and she thought Sarah Walker would have called it the finest wedding gift of all, not the money, but the peace of it, one grieving man letting another go free. That night, when the guests had gone and the children were finally asleep, Lucy in her bed and Henry in his, both of them worn out with joy. Thomas took Clara up the hill under the crooked pine to the grave in the dark with a lantern. "I wanted to bring you here," he said. "Not to be sad. To introduce you. Proper." He set the lantern down by the marker, and he crouched, and he touched the two carved names, Sarah and the son, who never got his own, and he was quiet a moment. Then he spoke to the grave, low and steady, the way you'd speak to someone in the next room. "Sarah, this is Clara. She came out here to teach the children same as you always hoped somebody would. And she read your letter, the one I couldn't hear for 4 years." His voice went thick. "I heard it now. I did what you asked. I'm filling the house. And I want you to know I didn't forget you. I couldn't. But I stopped drowning in you, Sarah, and I think that's what you wanted all along. Not to be forgot, just to not be a grave I crawled into. So this is Clara. And I love her. And I loved you. And I've come to learn. A man's heart is bigger than I ever knew, big enough to hold a woman he lost and a woman he found, both at once, no lie in either one. Thank you for letting me. Thank you for telling me to." He bowed his head. "Rest easy, my love. The house is full again, just like you asked." Clara knelt beside him in the lantern light, and she put her hand on the marker too, over the name of the woman whose blessing had made all of this possible, and she said, quiet, "Thank you, Sarah, for the letter, for the children, for loving them so well they had that much love left to give a stranger off a coach. I'll take care of them, all 3 of them, Lucy and Henry and their stubborn, silent father. I promise you that. I'll fill this house so full it'll never be empty again. You have my word. And out here, I'm told a person's word is about all they've got." They stayed on the hill a while, the 2 of them in the dark at the grave of the woman who'd given them to each other, and then they went down together to the house that was no longer holding its breath, and they began their life. The seasons turned. Winter came hard the way it does in that country, and the breeding stock came through on the hay they'd saved from the fire, thin but alive. And in the spring the calves dropped and the herd began again. From nearly nothing. The way everything in that valley began again, from nearly nothing over and over. Season on season, because starting over is the whole business of living on a frontier. Thomas built the herd back. Clara taught school. Henry grew a full inch that year and took to riding out with his father at dawn, the 2 of them side by side in the gray light, and the boy who'd sworn to hate the Boston teacher took to calling her Ma somewhere around Christmas, quiet like it slipped out, and then kept doing it because nobody made a fuss, and it turned out he'd wanted to all along. And Lucy. Lucy, freed of a guilt she never should have carried, laughed more that year than she had in her whole life before it, and learned her multiplication tables, and asked Clara approximately 4,000 questions, and slept without the bad dreams that had woken her. Screaming those first weeks, the dreams nobody had understood were guilt, until Thomas lifted it off her on the porch. But the frontier does not hand out easy years, and there was more coming, because there is always more coming in a life lived that close to the edge of things. It came in February, in the worst blizzard the valley had seen in a decade, 3 days of white, that buried the fences and killed cattle where they stood and cut the ranch off from town and everything else. And on the second night of it, Lucy took a fever. It came up fast the way fevers do in children, and by midnight the little girl was burning hot and talking to people who weren't there, and Clara knew she'd seen enough of it in Boston in the tenements, where she'd done charity teaching. She knew this was the bad kind, the kind that took children, and the doctor was in town, and town was 8 miles off through a blizzard that had already killed grown men that winter. "I'll go," Thomas said, already pulling on his coat. "You'll die," Clara said. "Thomas, no man could make 8 miles through that tonight and live, you know it. You've said it yourself about lesser storms. That's my daughter burning up in there. And you're her father, and she needs you alive. I'll go." It was Henry. He stood in the doorway in his nightshirt, 12 years old, white-faced, and he said it again steadier. "I'll go, Pa. Not through the storm. I know another way." He looked at them both. The Croft place. It's 3 miles, not 8, and it's downwind in the lee of the ridge the whole way. Silas keeps a hand who used to be a horse doctor. Old Pete, he set my arm when I broke it. He knows fevers. He doctored half the stock in this valley. 3 miles downwind I can make. 8 miles into the wind, nobody can. Let me go to Croft's. Let me go get Pete. Absolutely not, Thomas said. You near drowned in that river. I'll not send you out in a... Pa. And there was something in the boy's voice, something grown, something that stopped Thomas cold. You told Silas Croft in the firelight that you don't fight alone anymore. Well, neither do I. I'm not a little kid. I rode drag to Bozeman. I held the herd. I'm a hand on this ranch same as you and my sister's dying, and I know the one way through, and you're gonna let me take it because it's the only way she lives, and you know it same as I do. He was already reaching for his coat. 3 miles downwind, to the man who tried to burn us out to ask his help saving Lucy, and he'll give it Pa. I know he will, because you crouched down in the mud beside him, and you gave him back something he'd lost, and a man pays a debt like that. You taught me that. Now let me go pay off the whole valley's worth of trouble with one ride. And Thomas Walker looked at his son. His son, who'd been a hard, sullen boy in a doorway, swearing to hate a stranger not 6 months before, and was now a young man, volunteering to ride into a blizzard to save his sister's life. And Clara watched the father war with everything in him. And then she watched him do the hardest thing she'd ever seen him do, which was trust. Take the roan, Thomas said hoarse. He's got the best sense in the storm. Keep the ridge on your right hand the whole way, and don't you let it out of reach for 1 second. You hear, if you lose the ridge, you lose everything. And Henry. He grabbed his son and held him hard 1 fierce second. You come back. You bring Pete or you don't, but you come back. I'll not bury a child on that hill. Not you. Not ever. You come back to me. I'll come back, Pa. And Henry Walker rode out into the blizzard 12 years old on the best horse they had to save his sister's life. And Thomas and Clara stood in the doorway, watching the dark swallow him. And then they shut the door against the killing cold, and went back to the burning child. And they began the longest night of both their lives. Clara did what she knew. Cool cloths and willow bark tea forced sip by sip through cracked lips. And Lucy's small hot body, wrapped and unwrapped, as the fever raged and broke and raged again. Thomas sat on the other side of the bed and held his daughter's hand, and prayed this man who'd stopped believing in much of anything 4 years ago on this same kind of night, prayed like his own life hung on it because in every way that mattered, it did. And somewhere out in the white, a boy rode 3 miles downwind with a ridge on his right hand, carrying the whole family's hope in his frozen fingers, riding to the one man in the valley who had every reason to slam the door, and the best reason in the world not to. The hours crawled. Midnight. 1. 2. The storm screamed against the house. Lucy got worse before she got better. There was an hour near 3, when her breathing went so shallow and her skin so gray that Clara caught Thomas's eye across the bed and saw her own terror mirrored there, the both of them thinking the same unspeakable thing, and neither one saying it. And Thomas leaned down and put his mouth to his daughter's ear and whispered fierce, "Don't you go, Lucy Bug. Don't you dare. Your brother's riding through hell right now to save you, and you are not gonna make a liar of him. You hold on. You hold on till he gets back. That's an order from your pa, and you always were a stubborn thing, so you be stubborn now. Hold on." And whether it was the willow bark or the prayer or the sheer force of a father's will, or whether it was only the turning that fevers take when they mean to turn near 4 o'clock. Lucy's breathing eased and her skin cooled a degree, and she slept real sleep. Not the burning delirium. And Clara felt the child's forehead and felt the fever finally breaking, and she looked at Thomas and nodded, and the man put his face down on the blanket beside his daughter and wept with relief for the second time that winter. And at 4:30, over the scream of the storm, they heard it hooves in the yard, and voices, and the door banging open, and Henry Walker staggered in half-frozen and entirely alive. And behind him came old Pete, the horse doctor, stamping snow off his boots with his bag in his hand. And behind him, to Clara's everlasting astonishment, came Silas Croft himself, wrapped to the eyes, having refused to let a 12-year-old and an old man ride back into that storm without him. "Where's the child?" Pete barked, already shedding his coat, and Clara pointed, and the old man went to work. But Clara was watching the doorway where Silas Croft stood dripping and frozen, and where Thomas Walker had risen from, beside his daughter's bed, and the two men looked at each other across the room. The two men who'd loved the same dead woman. The two men who'd tried to destroy each other, and then saved each other, and Silas said gruffly, "The boy come poundin' on my door sayin' Lucy was dyin'. Couldn't very well—" He stopped, cleared his throat. "Couldn't very well let a Walker child die 3 miles from my place. Not after everything. Sarah had never forgive me, and I've got enough of Sarah's forgiveness to earn back without addin' to the tab." And Thomas Walker crossed the room and gripped Silas Croft's frozen hand in both of his, and no words passed between them that needed to. And Clara understood she was watching the last of it die. The last of the 4-year war. The last of the poison drowned for good in a blizzard by a dying child, and a brave boy, and two men who'd finally learned that the woman they'd both loved would have wanted them of all things to be brothers. Lucy lived. Old Pete stayed the night and the next day too, till the fever was surely gone, and pronounced her mended and ornery, and likely to outlive them all. Henry slept 18 hours, and woke a hero, and pretended he wasn't one, and failed. And Silas Croft, before he rode home when the storm cleared, stood over Lucy's bed a long quiet moment, looking down at the sleeping child. The child who was, though he'd never know it, and it didn't matter. No blood of Thomas's either. A child twice chosen now, once by Sarah, and once by the whole strange grafted family that had grown up around her. And something moved in the hard old face, and he touched the blanket once, gentle, and he said so low, only Clara heard it, "You look after her, schoolteacher. She's got Sarah's stubborn in her. I'd know it anywhere." And then he was gone back over the ridge to his own lonely place, but not so lonely now, Clara thought, not so poisoned. A man who'd found his way back from the far country of grief because 2 other travelers had shown him the road out, and the house on the wide grass filled up and kept filling season on season, the way Sarah had asked. Because that was the thing Clara Whitfield came at last to understand in her years on that ranch, that Sarah's wish had not been a small one, not just marry again, not just don't be lonely. It had been, fill this house. And a house gets filled 1,000 ways. With a new wife, yes. But also with a boy grown into a man who called her Ma. With a daughter freed of a lie. With a school full of valley children who came to love their teacher. With neighbors at the table and a reformed old enemy who came to Sunday dinner more and more as the years went on, until he was just family, and nobody remembered to think it strange. With laughter where there'd been silence and light, where there'd been a box under a bed kept shut against the dark. Thomas took the letters out of the box eventually. All of Sarah's letters. He and Clara read them together one winter, the two of them by the fire, and they laughed at the funny ones and cried at the tender ones, and when they were done, Thomas didn't put them back under the bed. He put them in a proper cedar chest in the main room, where the children could read them too, when they were grown enough, where Sarah could be a person the whole family remembered out loud, instead of a secret one man wept over alone. Because a house that's truly full has room even for its ghosts, Clara said not to drown in, but to remember. And Thomas, who'd learned the difference the hardest way a man can learn it, agreed. The grave on the hill got a proper stone that spring carved, with both names clear. Sarah and the infant son, and a low fence around it, and Clara planted it round with the wild prairie roses Sarah had loved, so that come summer the whole hill bloomed pink, and the two of them, mother and child, rested in a garden instead of a bare patch of grass. Lucy tended those roses her whole childhood. She never did learn as a girl that the woman under them wasn't her mother by blood, that came later when she was grown, told gently by Clara and Thomas together, just as Clara had promised on a summer evening on that same hill. And Lucy wept, and then she understood, and then she said the thing that told them they'd raised her, Write the thing that made all the long guarding of the secret worth it. So Mama looked at a baby that wasn't even hers and loved her so much she made her hers anyway. And Clara said yes. And Lucy said, wiping her eyes, "Then I'm the luckiest girl that ever lived, to be loved that hard by two mothers who didn't have to." And that was the end of the last secret, and it did not break her after all, because they'd waited and told it right, and love told right at the right time doesn't break a person. It builds them. The house filled and went on filling, and Clara Whitfield, who had once stood alone beside a trunk in a dusty frontier street, believing she'd traveled too far from everything she'd ever known, who had been tricked and pitied and nearly sent home, who had sold her dresses and hidden pennies in a tin and stood waist-deep in a freezing river and read a dead woman's blessing by lamplight and faced down a man with a torch and nursed a child through a killing fever, came to understand that the town's cruel scheme and life's crueler accidents had between them carried her exactly where she was always meant to be. Not to a job, not to a bargain, to a family, to a home. To the one place in all that wide, hard country where a woman with a broken past and a heart she'd sworn never to risk again could be needed all the way down by people who chose her back. She'd tell it that way years on when the young ones asked how she came to Montana. She'd smile, and she'd say she came out to teach and got taught instead, that she'd thought a home was a thing you were born into and couldn't get back once you'd lost it, and that a silent rancher and a biting boy and a bright motherless girl, and even, God help them, a reformed old enemy over the ridge had shown her different. That a home isn't the place you start from. It's the place you build out of firewood, split in the dark, and coffee poured at dawn, and truths told at last in the light, with whatever wounded, stubborn, honest souls life sees fit to hand you. And when they asked the young ones whether she'd ever gone back to Boston, whether she'd ever wished to, Clara Walker would look out over the wide gold grass to the hill where the roses bloomed and at the full loud house behind her, and she'd shake her head and say the truest thing she knew. "No," she'd say, "I never did. I thought once I'd come too far from home. But I was wrong. Sometimes the place you're tricked into, the place you never meant to go, the place you'd have run from if you'd had the fare, that's the place that was waiting for you all along. That's the place you finally belong." The years were good to the Walker Ranch, but the frontier never lets a family rest easy for long, and the hardest test of all came the spring. Clara had been married 5 years. The spring she learned she was carrying Thomas Walker's child. She told him at the supper table, quiet after the children had gone to bed, and Thomas went so still she thought for a terrible moment he was angry. Then she saw his hands begin to shake, and she understood it wasn't anger at all. "Clara." His voice came out cracked. You're sure?" "I'm sure. Come the fall." And Thomas Walker put his face in his hands at his own supper table, and Clara's heart seized, because she knew exactly where his mind had gone up the hill under the pine to Sarah, to the son who'd died, and taken his mother with him. She was up and around the table and kneeling beside him before he could hide it. "Thomas, look at me. This is not that. Do you hear me? This is not 4 years ago. I lost her," he whispered. "I lost Sarah exactly this way. Happy at this table telling me a baby was comin', and by spring I buried her on that hill. I can't, Clara. I can't do it again. I can't stand at another woman's. I can't lose you." "You're not going to lose me." She took his face in her hands fierce. "Listen, we're not two young fools 8 miles from a doctor with no idea what's coming. We know now. We'll have old Pete out weeks before my time. We'll bring the doctor from town and board him here if we have to. We'll do everything different than you did before everything. And I am strong, Thomas. I am strong as a mule, and twice as stubborn. You've said it yourself 100 times. I am not Sarah, and this is not that night, and you are not going to lose me. But I need you not to spend the next 6 months dying every single day of a thing that hasn't happened and isn't going to. I need you to be glad. Can you be glad, Thomas? For me. For this baby that's going to fill that house even fuller." Thomas looked at her a long, wrecked moment. And then, slow, something broke open in his face that was terror and joy, so tangled together they couldn't be pulled apart, and he put his big, rough hand flat against her stomach, and he said hoarse, "A baby. Our baby." And the terror was still there. It would be there every day till she was safely through, she knew that. But the joy was there too, and the joy this time was winning. "All right," he said. "All right, Clara. I'll be glad. God help me, I'll be scared to death, and glad both at once, the way you taught me a heart can hold two things. I'll be glad." The news went through the family like spring through the grass. Lucy, 13 now, and shooting up like a weed, was beside herself. She'd wanted a baby in the house for years, had asked for one so often. Clara had finally told her babies weren't a thing you could special order from the mercantile. Henry, 17. And near-grown, a young man now who ran half the ranch and courted the Dune girl in town on Sundays, took the news with a man's quiet gladness, and one hard, private word to Clara, in the barn, that she never forgot. "Ma." He'd taken to calling her that so long ago now, neither of them remembered when it started. "I heard Pa crying the night you told him. Through the wall." He looked at her steady. "Same way I used to hear him cry over my first ma. 4 years I heard that sound growing up." His jaw worked. "I don't want to hear it again, Ma. Not that sound. Not over you. So whatever it takes, the doctor Pete, whatever it costs, whatever I got to ride through you, tell me, and I'll do it. I lost one mother. I'm keeping this one." And Clara, who'd shaken this boy's fierce testing hand across his dead mother's table 9 years before, and won him 1 cup of black coffee at a time, held her grown son in the barn, and wept, and promised him she'd come through and meant it with everything she had. But the frontier doesn't take promises. And when Clara's time came that fall, it came early. 3 weeks early, the way Sarah's had, and it came in the night, the way trouble always seemed to come to that house. And Thomas Walker stood in the doorway of the birthing room, the color of ash, and Clara saw in his face that he'd walked straight back into the worst night of his life. But they'd done it different this time. That was the thing. Old Pete was already there, had been boarding at the ranch a week. Henry had ridden for the town doctor at the first sign, and the roan was fast, and the roads were dry, and the doctor came inside the hour. And there were women, Mrs. Dune and 2 of the valley wives Clara had won over the years, teaching their children, come to sit with her, and hold her hands, and do the ancient work women have always done for each other in those rooms. Sarah had labored and died nearly alone, with only a frantic, helpless husband and no help within a day's ride. Clara labored surrounded by skill and by hands and by love. It was long and it was hard, and there was an hour near dawn that Clara would never speak of, after an hour when even the doctor's face went tight, and Thomas, banished to the porch, sank down against the wall of his own house and prayed the way a drowning man prays. Henry sat beside his father on the cold boards, and neither of them spoke, and both of them listened to the sounds through the wall. The same wall Henry had listened through as a boy, and the boy who'd become a man put his arm around his father's shoulders and held on. The son holding the father up. Now, the way it comes to be if a family lasts long enough. And then, just as the light came gray over the grass, a new sound came through the wall. A baby's cry. Thomas Walker came up off the porch floor like a man pulled by a rope. But he didn't move to the door. He couldn't. Because a baby crying meant a baby lived. But it didn't mean Clara and he stood frozen in the gray dawn, with his whole life balanced on a knife's edge, unable to take the step that would tell him which way it fell, until the door opened and Mrs. Dune stood there with tears streaming down her tired face. And Thomas couldn't read them. Couldn't tell if they were grief or joy, and he made a sound that wasn't a word. "She's fine," Mrs. Dune said, quickly seeing his face. "Thomas, she's fine. Clara's fine. Tired, and she's had a time of it, but she's sitting up, and she's asking for you, and she's got your daughter in her arms. You hear me? They're both fine, both of them. Go on in. Go meet your girl." And Thomas Walker walked into that room on legs that barely held him. And there was Clara, pale, spent, soaked with sweat, alive, propped up in the bed with a red, squalling scrap of new life against her chest. And she looked up at him, and she smiled the most exhausted, triumphant smile he'd ever seen. And she said, I told you I'd come through, you stubborn man. Did you ever once believe me? And Thomas crossed the room and sank down beside the bed and gathered his wife and his new daughter both into his arms at once, and he couldn't speak, he just held them shaking, and Clara freed one hand and stroked his gray hair and murmured, "I'm here. We're both here. It's not that night, Thomas. It was never going to be that night. I'm here." They named her Sarah. It was Clara's idea, and when she said it, Thomas's face crumpled all over again. "Clara, you can't. That's not. You don't have to do that." "I want to," Clara said. "Listen to me, Thomas Walker, because I've thought about this a long time. Sarah gave us everything. She gave us Lucy the night she took her up. She gave you the blessing that set you free. She told you to fill this house, and this baby is the house filling exactly the way she asked. There is not one thing in my life, or yours or these children's, that Sarah Walker didn't have a hand in making possible. And I am not the kind of woman who's threatened by a good dead woman's memory. I never was. I loved her too. In my way, a woman I never met through her letters, through her children, through you. So we'll name this baby Sarah. Not to replace anybody, to thank somebody. To say her name in this house with joy instead of only grief. Can you understand that?" And Henry standing in the doorway. Henry, who'd been 8 years old when his first mother died and had listened to his father weep her name through the wall for 4 years, Henry said in a rough-grown voice. "I'd like it, Pa. I'd like there to be a Sarah in this house again that I could say happy. I never got to say her name happy, not once in my whole life. I'd like to." And that settled it. And the baby was Sarah, little Sarah, Sarah Walker, come again to a house that could finally hold the name in the light. Lucy appointed herself second mother on the spot, and never once relinquished the post. And in a strange completing of a circle, none of them spoke aloud, but all of them felt Lucy, the chosen daughter, the twice-loved girl holding her baby sister, who bore the name of the woman who'd chosen her, the family. Sarah Walker had dreamed of, on her last happy night, the family complete, the brother and sister by love, and the sister by blood, all under one roof, at last came finally fully into being. Sarah had died the night she thought she'd completed her family. She'd been 13 years, and a whole other mother early. But she'd been right. The family did complete. It just took longer and stranger roads, and a Boston schoolteacher off a coach, and a fire, and a fever, and a reformed enemy, and a great deal of firewood split in the dark to get there. The years rolled on the way years do faster and faster the more of them there are. Henry married his Dune girl the following spring, and took the north quarter of the ranch to build on close enough to ride to Sunday dinner every week, and in time he had sons of his own, Walker boys running the same grass their grandfather had cleared, and he raised them the way he'd been raised the second time around, with a father who talked, who wasn't afraid to say the tender thing. Because Henry had learned from watching Clara teach his own silent father how, and he'd sworn his boys would never grow up straining to hear love through a wall. They wouldn't have to. He said it out loud to them every day the way nobody had said it to him, until a teacher poured him a cup of black coffee and treated him like a man worth telling things to. Lucy grew into the great beauty of the valley, and turned down every suitor for years to Thomas's private despair and Clara's private amusement, until a young doctor came to set up practice in Miller's Crossing, a decent, quiet, book-loving man who'd trained back east, and Lucy, who'd inherited from nobody by blood, but from Clara, by every day of her raising a bottomless love of reading, met her match at last. They married in the schoolhouse where all the Walkers married, and Clara and Thomas told her the truth of her birth the summer before the wedding on the hill by the roses, and Lucy wept and understood, and called herself the luckiest girl that ever lived, and went to her wedding whole. And the doctor she married never wanted for a busy practice, because half the valley had watched old Pete grow old, and worried what they'd do without a healer, and here was a young one married into the most beloved family in the county. The frontier looks after its own in its hard, slow way, and little Sarah grew up the most cheerful child the ranch had ever seen. Sunny, where Henry had been hard and steady, where Lucy had been wild. A child raised entirely in a full house that had never once held its breath. who couldn't have imagined the silence her father and brother remembered, who knew grief only as a thing you visited politely on a hill full of roses, and not as a stone you carried in your chest. She was proof, that child. Living proof of everything Clara had built. The first walker in a generation who grew up not knowing what a locked box under a bed even was. Silas Croft came to every wedding, every christening, every Sunday dinner until the valley forgot he'd ever been anything but the family's gruff old friend, the children's honorary grandfather, the man who taught the boys to whittle and told the tallest stories and always brought Lucy prairie roses on her birthday without ever once explaining why. He never married. He never quite got over Sarah. Clara understood not all the way. Some loves don't heal. They just make room for other things to grow up alongside the scar. But he got over the poison. He died an old man in his own bed, with Thomas Walker holding one hand and Henry holding the other, having lived long enough to be loved after all, which was more than the bitter man in the firelight had ever thought to deserve. They buried him on the hill at his own asking near Sarah, but not too near a respectful distance the way he'd have wanted. "So I can look after her still," he'd said near the end, with the ghost of his old gruffness. "Somebody ought to. Reckon I've had the practice." And Clara, who'd told a lie all those years ago about Sarah hoping for him, a lie that turned a man's whole life around, went up alone to his fresh grave the day after they buried him and said quietly, "You'd have been glad to know it was true, Silas. She would have hoped for you. Any woman worth loving would. I only said it early is all." And she planted a rose on him, too. Thomas Walker grew old on that ranch, and he grew old talking. That was the wonder of it. The thing the whole valley marveled at, that the silent man everyone had once feared became. In his later years, the man whose porch you stopped at to hear a story. The man who'd talk your ear off about cattle and weather, and his grandchildren and his wife. Especially his wife, always his wife. The loneliness that had defined him for the first half of his life became a thing he could barely remember by the end of it. Clara had done that. Clara and the children, and the years, and the full loud house had reached into the silent frozen country. A grieving man had walled himself into, and they'd thought it out acre by acre, until there was nothing left of the wall but a story he told the young ones, as a warning: don't do what I did. Don't lock your grief in a box. Don't be too proud or too scared to let love back in. He'd point up the hill when he said it to the roses. "I near wasted my whole life mournin' up there instead of livin' down here," he'd say. "Took a Boston schoolteacher and a boy near drownin' and a fire in the night to teach me different. Don't you wait that long. Life's too short and too hard to spend it in a box." And Clara. Clara taught school in that valley for 30 years. She taught Henry's children and Lucy's children and the children of children she'd taught when they were young themselves. She taught reading and sums and how to say, because which she said was the hardest word in the English language, and the most important, because was how you understood that everything had a reason, even the hard things, even the things that made no sense while they were happening. The whole valley learned its letters at Clara Walker's knee, and when she finally hung up her chalk, gray-haired and beloved, they held a supper for her that half the county came to, and they gave speeches, and Sheriff Pell, old now retired, but still upright, stood up and said what everyone knew, and nobody had ever said plain, that the council had done a wicked thing, tricking a young woman 2,000 miles under a lie, and that it had turned out to be the best wicked thing that Valley ever did, because that young woman had become the heart the whole community had grown up around. And everyone laughed, and everyone cried, and Clara stood up last and said the only thing there was to say. "You didn't trick me into a marriage," she told the crowded room with Thomas Gray, and proud beside her and her children and grandchildren filling 3 tables. "You tricked me into a home, and I've spent 40 years grateful for the deception. So I'll not stand here and forgive you for it. I'll thank you for it instead. Every last conniving one of you. You gave me the family I'd stopped believing I'd ever have. There's no forgiveness owed on a gift like that, only thanks." Thomas went first in the end, the way he'd always feared she'd be the one to go, and was quietly, guiltily glad it was him instead, because he'd never learned how to be alone again, and didn't want to relearn it now, an old man at the end. He went in his sleep in the winter with Clara beside him, and his last clear evening, he'd held her hand by the fire and said, "You know what I think about Clara? All these years on, I think about that firewood. First weeks you were here, splitting it small in the dark so you wouldn't know it was me. Couldn't say a blessed word to you. Had to say it in kindling." He'd laughed soft. 40 years married and I can talk the ear off a fence post now, and it all started with a man too scared to speak saying I'm glad you're here the only way he knew how. In firewood, left by a door, before the sun came up, I heard you, Clara had said, holding his old hand in both of hers. I heard every word of it, Thomas. I've been hearing you for 40 years. You were never as silent as you thought. And they buried him on the hill beside the first Sarah, the two women who'd loved him laid to either side. At last, no jealousy in it, only completion, because Clara had chosen his resting place herself, and chosen it there beside Sarah on purpose, telling her grown children plainly, "Your father had room in his heart for both of us at once, all his life, and never a lie in it. He can have room in the ground the same way. We love the same man. We'll keep him company between us." Sarah started this family, and I finished it, and there's no reason on earth we can't lie down together on the same hill and both call it right. And the valley, which had spent 40 years learning to love this woman's strange large way of seeing things, saw the rightness in it and said no word against it. Clara lived on 9 years more. She spent them on the ranch in the full house, surrounded never once alone, because the family Sarah had dreamed and Clara had built did not let its heart sit lonely, not for one single evening of those 9 years. There was always a grandchild wanting a story, or a great-grandchild wanting a lap, or a former student grown gray themselves, now stopping by to sit with the woman who'd taught them their letters. Lucy came every day. Henry ran the ranch and brought her the first calf of every spring to see. Little Sarah, grown and married with children of her own, named her own first daughter Clara, and brought the baby to the ranch and put her in her mother's arms, and the circle closed and closed and closed again. The way a family that lasts is only ever the same few acts of love, repeated down the generations. Firewood and coffee and truth, told in the light over and over world without end. And on her last evening, Clara Walker asked to be carried up the hill. It was summer, and the roses were blooming the whole hillside pink and gold, the way Sarah had loved it, and her grandchildren carried her up in a chair and set her down among the graves. Sarah's and Thomas's between the two women, and Silas Croft's at his respectful distance, and the small stone for the infant son, who'd never got his own life, but had in dying set in motion everything that came after. Clara sat among them all in the summer evening, and looked out over the wide gold grass to the full house below, smoke rising from the chimney. Children's voices carrying up the hill, and she was not afraid, and she was not sad, because a person who has filled a house as full as Clara Walker filled hers does not fear the quiet of a hill. She'd earned this quiet. She'd bought it with 40 years of noise. "I thought I'd come too far from home," she said to no one, to all of them, to the roses and the graves and the grass. That first day standing in that street, with my trunk nobody coming for me, I thought I'd traveled clear off the edge of everywhere I belonged. She smiled, and it was the smile of a woman with nothing left to fear and nothing left undone. But I was wrong. I hadn't come too far from home at all. I'd just finally come to it. It only took me 2,000 miles and a lying town and a silent man and a box of firewood to see that the place I never meant to go was the place that was waiting for me the whole time. She died that night in her sleep in the full house with Lucy holding one hand and little Sarah holding the other, and Henry standing at the foot of the bed, the way he'd stood at his father's, the way the son stands when the family passes its love from one generation into the next. And they carried her up the hill in the morning and laid her down beside Thomas on his other side from the first. Sarah, the three of them together. At last, the man and the two women who'd loved him and each other's memory, without a grain of jealousy between them, resting in a garden of roses above the house they'd all each in their turn filled, and the house stayed full. That was the ending, the real one, the only one that mattered. The house Sarah Walker begged her husband to fill on the last happy night of her life stayed full for 100 years, and more, full of walkers and the people walkers loved, full of children learning their letters and men learning to speak the tender thing out loud, and old enemies made into family, and grief kept in the light where it couldn't drown anybody, full of everything a house can be filled with, when the people in it decide over and over, generation after generation, to choose each other, the way Sarah chose Lucy, and Clara chose Thomas, and Thomas chose to live again, and Henry chose to call a stranger. Ma and Silas chose at last to set down his poison and pick up a rose. They were not two lonely people who happened to share a roof. They never had been, not from the first gray morning over the first cup of black coffee. They were two wounded, stubborn, honest souls whom a hard country and a cruel scheme and a merciful dead woman's blessing had steered against every wall they'd each built to keep love out straight into the only arms that could have held them. And they built out of that unlikely beginning the truest home the Montana Territory ever saw. Sarah Walker asked her husband to fill the house. He filled it. They all filled it. And it has never from that day to this been empty again.